Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The air is filled with smoke, but to Texan farmer Dan Murphy, it was all part of his daily routine. Unlike most men, Don lived for his workdays. Even at 57, he never grew tired of the fragrant fog of burning wood, the vast blue skies, and the rich, biting taste of the honey his bees tirelessly produced. It certainly wasn't the highest-paying job, but any job that involved going outside and interacting with nature was good enough for him. There were other beekeepers in his town, but Don Murphy was a titan among them. He often joked that half his job consisted of supervising apiaries other than his own. Of all his peers, his colonies were the strongest. They accepted new queens most readily, and their combs practically bled the golden brown stuff. It always humored him how bipolar the attitudes people held toward bees were. Don knew full well that the very same people who bought jars upon jars of honey from him also complained on a weekly basis about the swarms of bees invading their backyards. At least they made up the vast majority of ill will directed toward him. The ones going off about their flowers, their honey, were the most difficult to manage. When all was said and done, they were just folks looking to weasel their way out of another Jew in life. Don valued paying his dues with hard work, the timeless equation of input plus effort equaling output. The greater satisfaction of knowing his toils ultimately made a difference. "I'm one to talk," he thought with a smirk, as he smoked out his first hive. "Is it really work if you enjoy it?" Ignoring the befuddled bees crawling around his mesh visor, he removed the lid from the hive and pulled out a raft, smiling as he saw both sides were almost completely capped over with beeswax. "First go, good job, everyone," he said, depositing the raft into a wheelbarrow. The remainder of the rafts were only half-capped. Better to let them fill up entirely before harvesting. Don covered the wheelbarrow with a tarp before moving on to the next one. He pumped a fresh round of smoke in and around the openings before taking the lid off and lifting up a raft. Oh, Jesus, no. The raft was also coated with beeswax, but only about 6 adult bees were attached. Instead of crawling among the combs doing their business, they merely hung on, antennae waving feebly, as if they'd simply lost the will to continue working. "God damn it, no!" Don muttered, pulling out another raft where he could only see 2. The panic caused his skin to prickle as he moved toward a third raft and witnessed, with a plummeting heart, the nail in the coffin for his hive. The queen, recognizable from her plump size and painted thorax, likewise clung lifelessly onto the raft. Normally the queen was always surrounded by a convoy of worker bees cleaning her, communicating with her, but aside from the defining traits, she might as well have been one more torpid bug in the hive. CCD, Don thought with a sinking chill. Colony collapse disorder, the mysterious condition of bees, abandoning their hives and venturing aimlessly beyond their range, where they all perished in purposeless confusion. The theories regarding CCD were as varied as the answers were few. The only certain thing about it was the frustration and fear that plagued any and all afflicted beekeepers. "Why you all had to go?" Don sighed, before removing all the rafts and stowing them in the wheelbarrow. If the colony had truly gone its way, he might as well reap what he could from them. As he moved to the next hive, a flicker of movement atop a distant hill caught his eye. Squinting through the mesh, he could make out a blurry dot skirting near the crest, obscured by a layer of dry scrub. Coyotes and badgers were the most common interlopers on his property, but this thing's height and gait could only mean one thing. Don dropped the wheelbarrow and drew his revolver from his waistline. "You're on private property," he bellowed out at the figure. "Get the hell out of here. I'm well within my rights to shoot." The thing stopped and shifted, as if turning towards him. Don inched closer, unable still to make out a face. "Turn back now!" The loss of one of his hives had incensed him to the point of spitting with fury, directing his rage toward the trespasser. 3 seconds! The figure seemed to bend over, then straightened up again, rocking back and forth. A gust of dry wind punched in Don's direction, and with it carried the sound of mocking laughter. Don pulled the trigger, and he fell into a split-second shock from the crack of the gun. But he ripped off his mask and stared wildly at where the figure once was. Breathing heavily, he tore through the apiary and up the hill, his bee suit catching on brambles and thorns. A stitch in his side, he arrived at the spot, looking around for any sign of an intruder. Footprints, hair, anything. Nothing. Don emitted a ragged sigh and trudged back. Despite his anger, he knew the trespasser had nothing to do with his hive. Bees would first die attempting to deter an intruder before they went so far as to abandon their home. But as he maneuvered the wheelbarrow among the rest of the hives, he wondered offhandedly how much more strangeness he'd had to put up with. Later that evening, Don and his wife Janine oversaw the extraction of the harvested honey in their garage. A brief spin in a hand-powered centrifuge sucked the liquid from the rafts, which drained through a spigot and through a sieve to catch any errant bits of wax. Despite the drama from earlier in the day, it was a decent haul, nearly 4 jars worth. A2 died today. Don grunted, tying a signature red bow around the jar. Open it up, and damn near nobody was home. Never knew a bee could look depressed, but now I know. Janine lowered her head. She too knew of CCD. "Why do they do that, Don?" "Wish I knew," he replied. "If I did, though, they might kill me for owning such knowledge." Janine set her jar aside. "I mean, if it ain't parasites or disease or chemicals, could they just up and decide to leave?" Decide? The word, in that context, felt like a foreign language on Don's tongue. There's a reason it's called a hive mind. Bees have no free will of their own. They'll stick to their queen until their dying breath. Apparently not. That don't mean they're not physically capable of leaving, Janine countered. If they think something's wrong, they'll jump ship. That's not free will, that's instinct. "Come off it, Janine," said Don. "They have nowhere to go, and they die soon after. What's the point of that instinct?" Janine shrugged, looking away. "Maybe some things are worse than that." Don scoffed. "Well, maybe when you get out there in the sun working with me, you can lecture me on the workings of bees." "I'm not getting into this now," Janine snapped, an edge to her tone. She tied off the last jar and strode back into the house. "I'm going to bed." Don heard her angry footsteps going up the stairs and settling in their bedroom. He shook his head and grabbed a beer from the fridge, figuring he ought to cool down even more before joining her in bed. He walked out back and settled on his chair, overlooking the desert night. The stars never failed to impress him. A liquid wash of celestial fire in the sky above. The distant buzz of bee activity had finally died down. Bees often worked into the night, but even they had to sleep at some point. The porch light above him dimmed, and he heard the clatter of insect wings. "No, please, no," Don moaned, looking up. Bees affected with a parasitic maggot would often hurl themselves into lights at night, for similarly unknown reasons. Pathogenic brain worms were the last thing Don wanted to deal with after CCD. But the thing smacking itself against the light was no bee. It was much larger, about the size of his thumb, its wings clacking sickeningly on the glass. It circled erratically like a carp on a line, rendering it difficult to focus on. Don could make out a burnt orange color and black stripes, and dark, waspy eyes. Perhaps a western cicada killer, relatively innocuous despite its name. Regardless, the thing was interfering with his peaceful night, so Don reached over and switched the porch light off. Silence came creeping back, and Don leaned back in his chair, taking a drink, savoring the beer's sweet, prickly pear flavor. Listening out, Don heard nothing in the bushes beyond. He smirked. Whoever that was would not come back after being shot at. Sometimes you just gotta let some things speak for themselves, he thought, going for another sip. He shot up from his chair and sputtered frantically as the bottle touched his mouth, and 3 pairs of clawed legs grabbed onto his lower lip. He swatted at his face, dropping the beer, backing up and tripping over his chair. He made contact with something hard and sharp, but not before a shooting pain spiked the corner of his mouth. "Shit!" he spat, scrambling inside the house, slamming the screen door shut. He hobbled to the bathroom, turning the light on, examining his injured lip in the mirror. Blood oozed from the sting, which seethed on the sensitive skin. He cursed at his stupidity, remembering that pollinating insects were often attracted to fruity aromas. Now he would have to look forward to a swollen face in the morning. Yeah, serves me right, for being an asshole to Janine, he thought bitterly. But as he watched, the wound continued to sear without the debilitating crawl of injected venom. Don stared at his reflection for a solid 10 minutes before going to rub his lip. It hurt, but he concluded it was nothing more than a flesh wound. "Strange," he muttered. Looking closer, he saw that instead of swelling, the flesh had been cleaved away, as if from a pair of mandibles. What bit me? He asked himself. Cicada killers certainly didn't bite, and Don didn't know of any other insect nests in and around the property. Whatever it was nothing he'd seen before. He washed out the wound with soap and water, squeezing the remaining blood out before dabbing it away and heading up for bed. Everything that day had been so sudden, so fucking weird. Don hoped he would find better respite in his dreams. A buzzing woke him up. Don shot up in his bed, yelping in panic, his lip pulsing with soreness. Then he realized his smartphone was merely vibrating on the nightstand. He picked it up and answered sleepily. "Don Murphy." "Don? It's Carla." His neighbor down the road was a regular who used his honey for baking. I'm going to need another jar soon." Don's brow furrowed. "We have plenty in stock right now. You can come on over anytime." "I did," Carla replied. "I tried going up to your door earlier this morning, but your bees kept coming at me. One of them landed in my hair, and I said, 'Nope,' and turned right around back home." "Nah, that couldn't have been," said Don, rubbing his temples. "My bees don't attack people." "Well, something did," said Carla, rather sassily. "I'm not coming over there again, but if you'd like to bring a jar over to my place, I'd gladly accept that." "Okay, sure. Goodbye." Don hung up and immediately went for his bee suit, slipping into it. He had a pretty shrewd suspicion as to what it was that attacked Carla. Janine peered drowsily at him from her spot in the bed. "What's the matter, Don?" "Hopefully nothing," he growled, fastening his mask on. "I'm just going to check something." Before his wife could follow up, he was down the stairs and bursting through the front door. The morning sun blinded him, but he couldn't see anything flying around. He examined the potted flowers, the corners of the patio, and the bushes out front. He looked up into the air to empty, cloudless skies. Then, on another gust of dry wind, came the sound of his bees buzzing. They seemed louder than normal and deeper. "Shit!" Don hissed, rushing around the back of his house to the yard. He rounded the corner and halted when he saw the entire apiary was storming with furious honeybees, battering Don's suit, some trying to sting him. Don brushed them off and charged into the fray. They were all hopped up on defensive pheromones, driven wild with a desire to go after anything that resembled a threat. As to what that threat was, he stopped dead when he saw it. His prize hive, A1, had been bored with jagged holes, and bees were swarming in and out of them, looping erratically around a posse of bulky, demonic hornets that were chewing their way in. Their color and sound matched the mystery bug from the night before. As Don watched in horror, the hornets simply hooked bees with their legs and decapitated them in one fluid motion, discarding their wriggling bodies to the ground below. Don exploded with a scream when he saw what laid on the ground. A virtual carpet of dying honeybees, almost all missing their heads, crawling listlessly over each other, tangling in each other's splattered innards. The hornets were emerging from the hive now, their mandibles stuffed with honey and larvae, which they devoured right before Don's eyes. Don bellowed and ran to the porch, where he grabbed a shovel and sprinted back to the hive, whacking and swinging with all his might. Solid metallic thunks assured him he had hit his mark, but the remaining hornets swirled up in a spiral and descended upon him like predatory birds. Their claws digging in, they bit into his suit and stabbed him with their stingers. Only a few hit skin around his ankles, but Don cried out in agony as the pain exploded in his feet, scorching like bullets of fire. He stamped and jumped, squashing the bugs, which burst their engorged guts over his clothes. He ran back toward the house, throwing open the screen door and slamming it shut. "What happened, Don? Are you okay?" Janine screamed as she bolted down the stairs. Don fell to the floor, clutching his ankles, blowing air through his gritted teeth. "Close the door, the glass door, close it," he rasped. Hornets landed one by one on the mesh panel, burrowing their thick mandibles through, biting lesions through it. "Get out of the way," Janine said, grabbing hold of the door. Don scooted along the floor, groaning as Janine finally slammed the glass door, locking it for good measure. The hornets gathered on the outside, their buzzing vengeful and devilish. "Are the windows closed?" Don demanded. "Yes, they're all closed," Janine confirmed. "Jesus Christ, Don. What the hell are those?" Don tried to bring himself to his hands and knees, but a wave of dizziness struck him, and he fell backward to the floor and vomited. The pain was shooting electricity up his bones, invoking spasms, clouding his head. His last flash of rationale told him he'd only been stung twice or thrice, not nearly enough to cause serious damage. As tears squeezed through his eyes, he shot one last glance through the glass at his ravaged apiary and saw a man standing among the swarm. He was barefoot and fully covered with animal pelts, his eyes wide and white, and his mouth was unhinged in laughter. And the sound of it seeped through the glass, and Don convulsed again as he suddenly recognized that laugh. The jeering noise followed him into unconsciousness, and he slipped away into a void of hellish black. On the couch, Don came around, feeling as though baseballs had been stuffed under the skin of his ankles. He leaned up and saw both feet sported 2 swollen red lumps. Janine had pulled up an ottoman futon and was applying a hydrocortisone cream to his wounds. "Take this," she said tenderly, handing him a pill and a glass of water. Don swallowed the pill without taking a drink. "The hives," he croaked, looking at his wife. She shook her head. They're gone. But they were at it for hours." Don's head fell back onto the cushion as he stared unseeingly into space. 10 years of management and upkeep, of connections and dealings, gone in the span of hours. "Those things were some kind of hornet," he said. "I've never seen anything like them before." "I have," said Janine. Dawn looked at her and she blinked. "No, I'm sorry. I found them online. Look." She unlocked her smartphone and showed the screen to Don, who craned his neck for a better angle. A blown-up picture of one of the hornets dominated the screen, its eyes black and sinister, jaws splayed in a threatening pose. "Vespa mandarina," read Don. "Asian giant hornet. Yes, I've heard of those too. But what are they doing in Texas? And so many of them, at least a hive's worth." "I was doing more research," Janine said. "You were out a long time. They began turning up on the West Coast a few years back. Everyone thought they were isolated occurrences, but now I'm paying for it," said Don. "Those things showed up and destroyed my work. We're ruined. Don, I'm sorry, but surely we can start over, can't we?" "No." Don swung his feet onto the floor and yelped as he put pressure on them. "If these things propagate and spread, there won't be anything to start over with. They were systematic. How they butchered my bees, like that's what they're evolved to do. These things are a goddamn death warrant for people like us." "So what are we going to do then?" Janine demanded. "We'll have to get rid of them." Don stood shakily to his feet, wincing from the burning agony. "Spread the word. Start calling people. Friends, family, neighbors." He began pacing in place, working the pains out of his feet. "If they're really gone, we need pictures of the hives. That'll get people talking, that's for damn sure. Don, there's one more thing," Janine said softly. Don looked at her. "What?" Janine pointed behind him to the glass back door. Overcome with dread, Don turned around and looked. Smeared on the outside of the glass were letters, sickly yellow, studded with black specks. Don inched forward down the hallway, staring at disbelief at the words on the door. "Find me." Don mouthed the words to himself, the image of that skin-clad man in the swarm suddenly striking through his mind. He turned and looked at his wife, who stared back at him, her expression one of unsettled confusion. "Someone's doing this to us," he declared. "Someone set those things on us. But why?" "Would you know this person?" Janine inquired. "No, I can't imagine anyone who'd do this to us," said Don, resuming his manic pacing. "We need to call the police, then," said Janine, pulling out her phone. "No," Don commanded. "That won't do. We can't pin him to the Hornets. All I can say is that he was trespassing. And the police won't do shit about the Hornets, even if they could find out where they've gone." Don hobbled to the glass door, pulling his boots from the closet. "I've worked too long and too hard to let this all go to waste." He fondled the top shelf, feeling around until he found his revolver. "There's no one to blame for this, but that don't mean I can't do nothing about it." "I'm going with you," said Janine, walking toward him. "No, you're not," Don snapped. "What if it's a trap? You stay here and watch the house. And if I'm not back in an hour, then you call the police." Don, Janine said simply. You and me are in this together. I'm coming with. That man's a fucking psychopath, Don shouted, advancing towards her. I'm not going to have you gutted or raped or whatever the fuck's on his mind. He tightened his grip on the revolver. I forbid you. Janine's face tightened. I don't need you to be a hero, Donald. I need you to be a husband. I am. He opened the glass door and slammed it in her face. I'm taking back our lives, because that's what I have to do. He holstered the gun and turned his back on her. Don had to fight back tears as he passed through the remains of his apiary. Half of his hives had been brutalized, each with their own mass killing of bees long dead. The other hives appeared to have been untouched. But Don walked up to one and flung the lid off, lifting a raft. Just as he thought, only a few benumbed workers and a single queen remained. They left, he said. Rather die starving and alone than face what was coming. He hesitated. How long have they been gone? During or after the assault? Or, he shuddered with forbearing, before. A rattling emanated from one of the damaged hives. The lid jerked as if something was pushing from underneath, and a single hornet crawled onto the top, coated in honey and the soiled corpses of baby bees, absent-mindedly chewing on one as it stared blankly at Don. Don stared back, drew his gun and fired. The lid blasted off, and what little remained of the hornet's mangled body fell softly to the ground. That's the least you deserve, he thought bitterly, pounding up the hill. The late afternoon sun beat down on him as he walked, scanning the vast, shrub-ridden desert, dyeing the rocks red and setting a haze in the distance. Don ruefully regretted not bringing a canister of water. He'd been more preoccupied with raining hell upon the marauder than considering his own health. His sweaty jeans chafed at his skin. His brain felt full of dusty air. But he kept his gaze on the horizon, determined to seek out the bastard, where he was hiding, and how he was controlling so many hyper-aggressive insects. Something buzzed past the back of his neck and he jolted, swatting reflexively. A hornet had zoomed past him and settled deep within a grove of desert scrub. The longer Don watched, the clearer he could hear a monotonous hum, as if hundreds of bugs were moving in unison. Let's see what the fuck kind of hive you're keeping, Don said, turning and heading for the grove. The branches were thick and bunched up against each other. He had to grab and break them away until he could squeeze through a gap. He emerged into a stony clearing and, startled, drawing his gun. I wouldn't take that shot, or else it would be your last. The apparition sneered. Don stowed the gun and glared at the man before him. Up close, underneath the shroud of pelts, Don could see he was very old, with sun-baked skin and deep wrinkles. A rabbit-skin hood obscured most of his face, but Don could make out yellow teeth and those same crazy eyes. Who the hell are you? And why are you so keen on destroying us? The old man snickered, rocking back and forth in spastic laughter. I have nothing against you, sir. You... Don leveled the gun again. You set those murder hornets on our property and killed every last one of our bees. I am far within my rights to kill you dead. Still your wrath, the old man said. No matter what comes out of this little powwow, I'm afraid you'll face the losing end. I suggest you see it through. Don kept his gun aimed at him, but his arm began to shake as fresh sweat beaded on his forehead. Who are you? That's immaterial, the old man laughed. But what I am? I am Yi not Lucy. Only an agent of the inevitable, caught on nature's sweeping tide. What the hell does that mean? Don shouted. Colonial arrogance at its most naked, said the old man, so concerned with molding this good earth like children playing with clay, woefully ignorant to the whim of the Great Mother. Don fingered the trigger. Start talking sense. The old man leered, eyeing him for an ugly moment. You and I are a lot alike in some ways, he finally said. I, too, loathe the arrival of these winged devils. He overturned his hand, and a hornet crawled from inside his sleeve, settling in his palm. When they enacted their scourge, I asked myself, how could this have happened? What did we do to deserve such unholy misery? His head twitched, and his neck gave a gnarly crunch. But I reminded myself each action must have a consequence. And this is no more apparent than in the colonial arrogance I endure each and every day. He bared his decrepit teeth at Don. When you spread your roots and shook hands with the rest of the world, did you really not expect to transmit a few germs? As Don listened with disgust, he realized that the buzzing, at first silenced, had begun to well up again. But the old man continued to talk. When you dig a canal, the water flows and things change forever. That is not a result of your ingenuity. That is just nature taking its course. What is happening here is nature taking its course, no matter how wicked and backwards that may be. He grinned again. That is where you and I are very different. You are a suppressor. I am its emissary. You did this because we think we're above nature? Don figured. The buzzing had grown louder. He had to shout to make himself heard. But I'm a beekeeper. Bees are endangered as they are. I keep them. They pollinate and thrive. How am I the bad guy? Why do I deserve this? Swallow your vanity, the old man snarled. You did nothing to deserve this. All I've done is ensure the consequences. Your bees were smart enough to leave their hives because they too went with nature's course. And you, standing in its way, propped up tall with your pride, will suffer the humiliating indignity of... Don shot the old man. He shuddered from the impact, his face frozen in mid-speech. Some yellow, glutinous juice frothed at his lips. His body gave an almighty tremor, and his pelts fell to the ground. Don let out a piercing shriek. The old man's bare skin from the neck down was peppered with a geometric pattern of holes, the texture of honeycomb, and crawling in and out of the flesh were thousands of hornets, the source of intensifying buzz. His eyes degraded into jelly, and 2 hornets burst forth from them, scuttling over his bald scalp, but the thing still cracked a smile. I warned you. It would be your last. Don scooted backwards, distancing himself from the creature, but it shambled towards him, trembling at its knees. I am Chaos, skinwalker to the winged devils. His voice was amplified and garbled, as if filtered through the hornets themselves. And while whittling through his powwow, I've unleashed chaos elsewhere, for such is its nature to strike with tenacious dispassion. No! Don bellowed, realizing instantly what he'd meant. He turned and crashed through the bushes, his feet blazing with fresh pain, limping as fast as he could back over the hill, where his house was, where his wife was. The buzzing hit an ungodly pitch behind him, and he upped his pace, threatening to trip and fall forward with each step. The settling sun was plunging the rocks into formless shadow. His foot struck a cactus, and he screamed, pushing forward, against the spine in his toe. The hill was just ahead. He clambered up it and threw his gaze down the slope to his house. And beyond his ruined hides, motionless at the center of the house, a figure writhed on the ground, surrounded by a gyrating swarm of hornets. "No! Janine!" Don screamed. He tumbled down the hill in his haste, colliding with rocks and shrubs, sliding to stop among a field of gravel. Broken, scraped, and in excruciating pain, Don crawled on the ground, blubbering madly, tears mixing with the blood in his mouth. "Janine, please, no!" He arrived at her side, riddled with pain, enduring fresh stings, staring down in tear-stricken horror. His wife's clothes were soaked through with red pinpricks, and every inch of her exposed skin was covered with swollen, necrotic sores. His hand reached for her head, but he stopped himself. He wanted to remember his wife's face as it was, beautiful, clean, and unmarred. As the venom pumped through his blood, he summoned a last jolt of energy and staggered to his feet, stumbling for the porch door. He grabbed the handle, leaning forward on it, and collapsed inside, finally kicking it shut. Immediately, a hail of hornets drilled into the glass, their durable exoskeletons resounding in sickening thunks. They chewed at the glass so close Dawn could see their individual mouthparts, flexing and glittering. Then they scurried beyond the door, onto the outside walls. They'll get in. If they want to, they will. He hauled himself across the floor, his body racked with toxins, the furniture swimming freely in his vision. He ended up in the living room, next to the couch Janine had treated him on. The water and medicine still sat on the table. Crawling towards it, he splashed the water on his face and downed a handful of antihistamines. It did nothing to quell the venom, but he could think clearer now. "She was right," he whispered, his eyes reddened from crying. "They knew. They fled, or at least some of them did." The hornet's buzz echoed down from up the chimney. Don turned his head to stare at it. Slumped against the futon, the bones in his limbs tingled uncomfortably, then fell limp beside him. The scatterplot of stings around his body flared with an acid kick, signifying his flesh had begun to dissolve. Something inhuman was creeping down the chimney, dripping its honeydewed blood. A few scouts had already emerged, hovering slowly above Don's shattered body, as if smelling his imminent death. Illuminated in a shaft of moonlight, the skinwalker reached its gangly arms from the chimney, dragging its way up the wall, gripping it with slender talons. A convoy of hornets clung to it like spiderlings. It twisted its neck to peer down at Don. "Pity," it drooled. "You too tried to flee, defiant of nature to your dying breath." It emitted an insectoid chatter. "Ignominy will be your coffin." Paralyzed from the neck down, Don tore his eyes away from the skinwalker, laying them instead on the medicine and water, the last things he saw Janine hold in her hands. His lips tightened with grief. He could still smell her perfume in the air, underneath the putrid scent of carrion and peat. Something laid on the floor next to the futon. Don squinted to focus on it. It was her smartphone. Don recalled the moment he'd come to. She was there, showing him that phone, relaying knowledge to him in her angelic voice. She knew about the Hornets. She knew about CCD. She knew. Don turned again to face the creature. He could feel the stiffness rising up his throat. Nevertheless, he spoke up. "End me, then," he gurgled. "But one day, you'll have to face the inevitable." "I am the inevitable," the skinwalker rasped. "You may have beaten me, but there are others out there too. And like it or not, people are a part of nature too." Don drew one final breath into his blackening lungs. And when the chips are down, you'll find that those others will come roaring back. Once they know how to beat you. You think you're some freaking higher being, but you're part of this just like everything else. Everyone else. And once we know how to deal with you, nature will, in due time, take its course. The skinwalker bared its teeth, its limbs trembling, with the effort to hold itself up. Don stared it down, forcing himself to remain lucid until the end. "Kill!" it hissed. As the hornets descended upon him, Donald Murphy felt the stirrings of something inscrutable and intangible, but somehow necessary, and all too real in spite of everything that had happened. Assurance.
Six Crows. Written by Daniel Davis. Narrated by Jeff Clement.
There were 6 crows in that telephone wire.
Rick glanced at his wife, who still had her face pressed against the passenger side window. What?
On that telephone wire back there. There were 6 crows.
Rick struggled for something to say, a witty comment or resentful retort. Instead, he grunted and returned his attention to the road. After a few seconds, Marie looked at him.
Did you hear me?
You mean about the crows?
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard you.
Don't you think that's odd?
Rick tried to find something in her eyes, some proof that she was baiting him, some sign that she was trying to make him look like a fool in front of their daughter again. What he saw made him frown. Marie looked worried. What's wrong?
There were 6 crows on that telephone wire.
She repeated. Rick swallowed, turned back to the road, and watched as one telephone pole replaced another. He felt Marie's stare, but not the way she used to look at him. In the beginning, it had been sexy. Now it was annoying. Carefully, he said, "I don't get it."
Didn't you ever hear the rhyme?
Apparently not.
My grandmother taught it to me when I was little, and she learned it when she was little, back in England. I don't remember it exactly, but it said something like different numbers of crows meant different things. Like 3 crows would mean good luck or something.
Does 6 crows mean we win the lottery? In the back seat, Chelsea giggled. Rick glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Thanks, honey. Daddy loves to have an audience.
Rick.
Yes, dear?
6 crows are unlucky. Very unlucky.
Uh-huh. Rick didn't have to fight back to laughter. After 7 years, he simply knew better than to laugh.
That was the 4th grouping of 6 crows that I've seen in the past hour.
Good thing it wasn't the 6th group. Then we'd really be screwed.
You don't think that's a little disturbing?
Marie, what I think is that your powers of observation are astounding. You managed to count how many crows were grouped together on a telephone wire while passing them at 60 miles per hour. Not only that, but I didn't even see the damn things.
Are you saying I imagined it?
He couldn't help himself. No, I'm saying only you would care.
Rick.
She let her voice trail off. The one good thing about their marriage, they had learned when to pick their fights. Whenever Chelsea was around was not an appropriate time. Still, their daughter could sense when something was wrong. In the rearview mirror, Rick saw Chelsea facing out the window, her eyes squinted. He knew how awkward it was trying to distance herself from the tension in front of her. He remembered feeling that way as a kid. It had been hell. Returning his attention to the road, Rick wondered how much further they had to go before they got out of Nebraska. The Atlas was in the back seat, highways highlighted in orange and pink, indicating an intricate pattern across the country. Perhaps the scenic drive hadn't been the best choice. It was taking far too long, and the Rockies wouldn't be in sight for another day or two at least. The interstate wouldn't have offered as many interesting detours, just the typical tourist destinations, but it would have gotten them there quicker and more efficiently. Rick found the two-lane highways, at least during the stretches through fields of wheat, corn, and hay, boring. He felt drowsy and out of it. In a couple hours, he had to turn the wheel over to Marie, who was, if nothing else, a competent navigator. At least the weather was in their favor. 2 days earlier, they had found themselves driving through a severe thunderstorm. Chelsea had been in tears, worried about tornadoes. Rick had placed the idea in her head and spent most of that hour mentally berating himself for it. Marie had to pull over, give the wheel over to Rick, and climb into the back with their daughter. She hadn't chewed Rick out that time. They'd both known it had been his fault. Marie had always been an artist with guilt. She knew when to lay it on and when to let it creep up at its own pace. The day was pleasant. Perhaps that was because the car was air-conditioned. Rick had experienced some horrible summers on the East Coast, but nothing prepared him for the barrenness of the Midwest. There were no trees, hills, or skyscrapers to block the sun. The heat was not a byproduct of the sunlight. It was the sunlight, unfiltered and uncompromising. The grass could take it. The grass and wheat were light enough to catch what little breeze blew across the fields, to sway in its brief reprieve.
But a man standing out there would feel nothing but the blistering heat.
We're in the middle of God's asshole, Rick thought, laughing. Marie's grandmother had been good for more than counting crows. She'd been a delightful dinner table conversationalist, with enough witticisms to start her own quotations dictionary.
What's so funny?
Marie asked. Rick noted that there was no hostility in her voice, only mild curiosity. Nothing, he said. You just got me thinking about Helen. Marie smiled.
You hear that, Chelsea? Daddy's thinking of Grandma Miller.
Grandma Miller,
Chelsea said in a low, throaty growl, an imitation of a voice roughened by too many cigarettes. That'd be her, Rick said. She of the varicose veins and halitosis.
what's that?
You'll find out in a few years, sweetheart.
We'll also have to
Discuss hernias, hemorrhoids, crow's feet. Instantly, Rick regretted what he said. He glanced carefully at Marie. Yes, the amusement was gone from her face, but her smile remained. Do you remember her chicken and dumplings? Rick asked, rushing the words out faster than he should have. Good Lord, I could have lived off them,
And her banana cookies.
Chelsea said from the back seat. Yeah, those too. And her raspberry pie, Rick added, smiling. Marie winced.
Ew.
Hey, you liked it,
I pretended to like it to make her happy.
Marie said. I call BS, dear. You ate it with gusto. You stopped liking it when you tried out the recipe, Rick told her.
She always said the main ingredient was love.
Doesn't mean you should skimp on the salt,
I just thought we should try eating a little healthier.
Marie said.
You didn't like the spare tire you were getting, remember?
Sorry I don't make enough to afford a gym membership.
Daddy, what's that?
Rick glanced into the rearview mirror. Chelsea was pointing at the windshield. He looked forward. Rick slammed on the brakes at the sight of something shiny in the middle of the road. Shit! Rick jerked the steering wheel to the right. The Toyota refused to turn with him. The car left the road, hit the gravel, and then drove headfirst into the ditch that separated the highway from the fields. The car came to a halt, the back bumper a couple of feet higher than the front. Rick stared out the windshield at the tall grass just a few feet in front of him, swaying back and forth. Damn it! He put the car in reverse. The wheels spun.
Rick.
He tried again. God damn it!
Rick!
He glanced at his wife. She placed a tentative hand on his shoulder.
Honey, turn the car off.
He stared at her for a moment, then did as she asked. He couldn't think of anything else to do. Marie unbuckled her seatbelt.
Chelsea, honey, are you all right?
Mommy.
Rick ripped his seatbelt out of the buckle and turned around. Chelsea appeared to be okay. She was frightened, more so than she had been a couple days ago during the storm, but otherwise unharmed. Comfort was Marie's department. His wife had always been good with that. What the fuck was that?
Rick!
Jesus, I'm sorry. Marie, who had climbed into the back seat with their daughter, glared at him over Chelsea's tangled blonde hair.
I don't know what it was. Maybe you should have been watching the road?
Chelsea's crying kicked up a notch. Rick focused his attention at the hayfield. A retort sat at the tip of his tongue, but she was right. He should have been watching the road. He wiped sweat from his face, and as he did, he noticed stubble grating against his palm. He took off his glasses and rubbed his temple. He racked his mind, trying to figure out what he could do. Rick turned the car on, and immediately cool, brisk relief filled the vehicle. He angled a vent directly on his face. He needed a second to cool off and collect his thoughts. After a few moments of silence, Rick calmed down, Chelsea's sobs subsided, and Marie's panting slowed, though he still felt her stare. The argument would be moved until later, reserved until they checked into the next motel. That suited him just fine. He looked in both side view mirrors, trying to see the object he'd run over. All he saw, though, was sky. I should check how bad it is, he said. See what we hit. Marie didn't say anything. By the way her jaw clenched, he could tell she'd wanted him out of the car. He couldn't blame her. Rick opened the door and stepped out, falling a few more inches than he expected. The heat didn't hit him as much as engulf him. As soon as he was outside the Toyota, the air conditioning became a distant memory. The sun, beating down on him with no clouds to absorb the blow, became everything. He shut the door behind him, purposely refusing to look into the back seat, as he checked to make sure none of the tires had blown, then scrambled up the ditch and onto the highway. The object that had caused him to derail the trustworthy Toyota lay a few yards down the highway. Rick shambled over to it. He stared at the object, cocking his head to the side, trying to figure out what it was. Some piece of metal, maybe from a tire or muffler. Awful shiny muffler, he thought. It wasn't anything, just an anonymous piece of thin metal, a few inches long, with one sharp end. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and threw it into the field. Fuck it, he thought as he walked back to the car. Marie rolled the window down in the back.
What did we hit?
We didn't. Thank God.
Well, what was it?
Rick shrugged. She rolled the window back up and turned back to their daughter. He stood at the back of the car, thinking about how hot it was and how tired he was from driving. He knew he would have to push the car on top of everything else. To that purpose, he hollered to Marie, "Pop the trunk. She did, and he began taking out their suitcases and setting them safely aside. He didn't know if it would help at all, probably not, but it gave him something to do while he prepared himself for the labor ahead. Once the trunk was emptied, he slammed it shut and walked back to the driver's side. As he climbed into the car, the air conditioning caressed his skin. His sweat dried almost instantly, leaving him shivering. Rick relished every second of it, leaning back in the seat, eyes closed.
Everything okay?
Marie asked. He opened his eyes as if waking from a deep sleep. Part of him hoped to see the road, a gas station, or a hotel. Instead, all he saw out his windshield was hay. He turned around in his seat. Marie was no longer holding their daughter. Chelsea sat beside her, flipping through one of the books she'd brought. Her eyes scanned the page intently. Rick felt a moment of pride watching his daughter read, thinking perhaps she may even become an English teacher like him, although hopefully she'd wind up someplace more prestigious than Clarkview Middle. His eyes shifted from his daughter to Marie, who glared at him with furrowed brows.
What are we going to do?
I need to push this car out of the ditch.
Can you do that?
If you're sitting here with it in reverse, yeah, probably.
Can't you just call a tow truck?
I thought you said we don't have any reception out here. She sighed.
The phone's there, beside you. Check.
Rick picked up the phone. No signal.
There's gotta be a farmhouse around here.
He coughed. Want to get out there and search for it? Probably miles down the road, either way.
How about flagging someone down?
How many cars do you remember us passing?
I don't know.
You can count crows, but not cars. I counted 4. That's 4 in the past 2 hours. This isn't a highway so much as it is a skid mark. We're alone out here. She smiled at him.
It's scenic though, isn't it?
Maybe Chelsea can go up the road and see if she can wave down a busload of cheerleaders or something. Chelsea giggled.
Okay, Daddy.
Rick smiled. The three of them stepped outside the car. Marie gasped in the heat. Rick was surprised how much his body seemed to have forgotten it so quickly. We ain't in Kansas anymore, though it looks about the same. As Chelsea disappeared over the hill, Rick called out, "Make sure you ask those cheerleaders if they have any beer with them."
Okay.
She called back down, laughing. Marie turned to him. Out there in the sun, she looked her age. Not that she was old, neither of them were old, but she wasn't a young co-ed anymore either. She didn't have a 20-year-old's body or grace. Certainly no college girl had those crow's feet. The sunlight seemed to highlight the creases in her face, the imperfections in her skin. He figured it was doing the same to him, an equal opportunity humiliation. She pulled her hair back and let it fall limp against her shoulders.
God, it's hot.
You said it, Rick agreed. Marie looked up the road.
She's okay up there, right?
She's better than us, he nodded. We've got work to do. When I pound on the hood, throw it in reverse. Don't stomp on the pedal. Just let it down gradually. I want to see how this thing's going to react. Marie got in and closed the door. Rick heard the soft purr of the automatic window rolling down as he walked to the front of the car. He leaned against the hood, putting some force into it. The car rocked. The push would take a lot of time, and he would be far too exhausted to drive to the next town. Marie could, though, assuming that there even is a town. Of course there's a town, he muttered.
Ready?
She asked. Sorry, this fucking heat. Remember, when I pound on the hood, throw her in reverse.
I was paying attention.
Amazing the patience you learned after 7 years of marriage. They'd been together 2 years before that, but patience had never really been a part of their relationship. They'd been too busy with school and sex. There had been love, of that he had no doubt. But love had complicated things. The first year of marriage hadn't been much different. They'd lived together before tying the knot, so they became accustomed to each other's bad habits. Even when the baby came, things had been going strong. When had it gone downhill? After the move? Clarkview wasn't the city. They had agreed the city wasn't the place to raise Chelsea. That was one of the few things they still agreed on. But Clarksville wasn't exactly the suburban life that Marie had in mind. Maybe they would have been happier elsewhere. Rick couldn't come up with a specific moment when he realized his marriage was ending. It was as though he'd always known it, which wasn't true at all. As a kid, watching his parents' marriage fizzle, then explode, he'd promised he would never do the same thing. He would marry for life. And he had. He really had.
He got his mind trailing, wiped sweat from his forehead, and slammed his palm onto the hood.
After he heard the engine accelerate, he pressed his shoulder against the front grille. Marie put the car in reverse and revved the engine. The car moved an inch or two, but quickly settled back into place. Marie leaned out the window.
You okay?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. Just give me a second.
You really think you can push this thing up from here?
Yeah, I can do it. Rick pounded on the hood and placed both hands against the grill of the car, wincing at the radiating heat. He pushed hard as Marie revved the engine, and the car moved a few inches, enough for him to step forward. He pushed again until his foot slipped in the grass and he fell. "Fuck!" he yelled as his cheek contacted the hot steel. Rick slid to the ground, grateful he didn't pull anything on his way. He rested against the bumper, breathing heavily.
You okay?
I'm all right. One more go, he said as he stood and prepared to push once more. It actually took 3 more tries. Inch by inch, they maneuvered the vehicle into a better position. By the end of it, Rick stripped his shirt off and was covered in sweat and grime. Marie reversed the car the rest of the way from the ditch until the tires finally took hold and the car jerked backwards. As he climbed the small incline, Rick fell again, but this time softly into grass and dirt. Rick heard Marie exit the car and call for him again. Between the sun and the exhaustion from pushing, he wanted to lie there. But there was something different in the way she called his name. He sat up, waiting for her to come to his side of the road. What is it?
Where's Chelsea?
He stood and looked around. She's not with you? Marie's voice became panic-stricken.
Why the hell would I ask where she was if she was with me?
He watched her march toward the opposite side of the road and looked back. He stopped himself from running after her. Running would mean there was a reason to run. Once on the road, he saw Marie a few yards away, pacing back and forth across the highway, looking down the other side. "Chelsea?" Rick yelled.
Chelsea?
Marie repeated. Marie turned back to him, wild-eyed. They both took turns calling out Chelsea's name without a response. Finally, Marie snapped.
Rick, where is she?
Tears streamed down her face. "She was here!" Rick screamed. "She was right fucking here! Chelsea!"
Come here right this instant!
Panic won. Rick ran, rechecking everywhere, his eyes following the path of the hay.
Did she get back in the car?
Marie asked, hopeful. The car. Yes, she had to be in the car. He hadn't heard her climb back inside, but then he'd been exerting himself, pushing it out of the ditch. He hadn't heard the door open, that's all. Hadn't heard it close either. He simply hadn't noticed. And neither had Marie, but she'd been caught up in what they were doing too. They both took off in a run. Marie flung open the passenger door, screaming.
Chelsea?
Rick watched her lift her hands to her mouth and step back from the car.
Oh my God.
What? He ripped open the opposing door.
She's not here.
Rick opened the trunk and dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain that shot up as the hot pavement raised his skin. She wasn't under the car either.
Chelsea Elizabeth Palmer, you come here right now!
Marie yelled, fists balled to her sides.
Chelsea!
Rick took a deep breath and yelled again.
Chelsea!
He ran back into the middle of the road. No sign of her.
Rick!
The tone of her voice changed again. What? He said as he took a step towards her.
Look!
Rick followed where her fingers pointed, expecting to see Chelsea pop out of the grass, but instead, his eyes rested on a telephone pole with birds perched along the wires. Crows. He counted 6. 6 crows. God damn it, Marie! Rick lashed out, furious.
Rick, that rhyme!
He had to slow down before he lost his mind. His gaze shifted from the crows to the grass below. Rick's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward. Behind him, he heard her mumbling something, but he ignored it and moved on a little faster. There was a break in the hay. Small, but still visible. The edge was distorted as if something had broken through. After a moment of staring, he comprehended what he was looking at. A hole in the dried grass. And he saw something else, too. Rick ran, stumbling down the ditch and landing on his knees in front of the hay. Marie was immediately behind him. They both stared, but not at the hole. Rather, what was in it and all around the hole.
What's that?
She asked, her voice trembling. Rick didn't answer. He continued to stare at what he knew was blood. It's not hers. We're in the country. That blood could belong to anything. Except they were alone out here. And the blood was fresh. They moved towards the small entrance. Marie dropped down to her knees beside him. Rick barely noticed. He stared hard into the hole, noticing how it seemed like someone had been dragged into it. Signs of a struggle. The words resonated in his head for a moment. And then it all clicked. Chelsea's in there. If she's bleeding, she's alive. Rick pushed Marie aside and broke into a run. He parted the tall grass as he took each long, hard step. It was easy to tell where she'd been. The hay grass was trampled, disorderly, unkempt. There was a trail, a path cut through the field, more or less straight on. Worse than anything, he followed a path of blood, left like a trail of breadcrumbs. He didn't see Chelsea anywhere. He thought about going back for some kind of weapon, but he had already wasted enough time. Marie gasped from somewhere behind him. She tried to keep up, but he forged on without waiting. "I'll get her," he said, hoping she would have the wits to turn back and flag someone down. This can't be happening. Rick thought clearly enough to know that despite his panic, despite the time he was losing, he needed to move carefully. If he ran too fast, he might lose track of the path. He went on, one long stride in front of the other. Grass brushed at his arms, face, and chest. A grove of trees, 100 or so yards away, caught his attention. He couldn't tell from that far back, but figured it was where the trail led. That's where she would go, or whoever, whatever, had her wood. It was the only thing out there besides the goddamn highway. Thoughts berated his mind, trying to loop him into a panic. He imagined worst-case scenarios, but he fought past it as he cut through the grass, still following the blood trail. He pushed on, the clearing not far. Tears stung his eyes. He stopped for a second to listen. Marie was stumbling through the trail, crying. Flies buzzed around his ears. Beetles crawled on his shorts and legs.
One crow is unlucky.
Marie's voice came from behind him. Rick tried to ignore her and started moving a little faster than before. He followed the path, each blade of grass splattered by a painter's brush. Rick wondered how much blood Chelsea had in her. Then he wondered why he would even think such a thing.
2 crows. Lucky.
He heard her say. She was on his heels now. He sped up, the clearing not much further. He tried not to notice her. He tried hard to ignore her words.
3 is health.
She said louder. Between the blood, heat, and Marie losing her mind, panic won.
4 is wealth.
Her ragged voice screamed. Running was illogical. He needed to slow down. He needed to think. He needed to conserve his strength. But logic was a thing of the past. Logic did not belong beneath a sun that knew neither joy nor pity. Logic belonged in the air-conditioned safety of the Toyota, while his daughter tried in vain to ignore her parents' bickering. Logic belonged back on the East Coast, in a house that was coming apart at the seams. The field opened to a grove of trees, an oasis in the patchwork. Rick stumbled into it, and Marie collapsed on the ground beside him, half in and half out of the grassy hill.
5 is sickness,
she managed to say. Marie regained her feet. Her breath was sharp and jagged. Rick saw she was staring towards the trees and followed her gaze to the center of the grove. Her gasps grew shriller until they petered out into half sobs. If it weren't for Marie, he wouldn't have seen the animal staring at them. It stood several yards away, beside a cluster of small trees grown thick together, its body tense, ready to attack. Rick didn't know if it was a jackal, wolf, or coyote, but he understood why his wife was hyperventilating. He knew as soon as he saw the canine. Blood coated its muzzle. Rick yelled. It was instinctive, primal, no conscious thought, just a buildup of air and a compression of the lungs. It must have been menacing enough, because the beast, a coyote, yes, it had to be a coyote, darted off in the opposite direction. The animal didn't make a sound as it dodged trees and exposed roots, its tan body disappearing like a shadow in the dark. Rick and Marie stood still, staring at where the coyote vanished. Images of the dog snatching his daughter from the road flashed through his mind. He took a step, knowing a pack of coyotes might be watching him from the shadows. Then he took another, and another. Each one cautious, each one forced by whatever willpower remained in his body. When Marie spoke again, he wanted to turn around and strangle her, to tell her she was a lying bitch, but all he could do was let the immensity of her words sink into his flesh like an anchor.
6 is death.
Rick reached the spot where the coyote had been. He turned so he could see behind the trees and stared down. Then he crouched carefully and reached out a hand, but quickly brought it back to his side. He stared until tears blurred his vision.
He looked away, blinking at a tree a few yards to his right.
There, in the top few branches, were a bunch of crows, all of them seeming to stare at him with black, accusing eyes. Rick couldn't help it. He didn't want to. But what he wanted didn't matter anymore. It hadn't mattered since the car had swerved off the highway into the fields that were now his prison. He counted the crows and began to scream.
What's an unmish? Thomas pulled heavily on his cigarette as soon as the words left his mouth, tipping his head back and looking down his nose at Mark while the tobacco smoldered. Thick cables of smoke laced their way overhead, mingling with the steam of a late June evening. In the lawn in front of Mark's porch, ghostly fireflies gleamed in the vapor, blinking quietly like the eyes of diligent spies. Thomas snatched the cigarette away, and the bright ember end went dark like another firefly. Blue smoke bloomed from his mouth and nose, obscuring his face. Overhead there was a percussive zither of grasshoppers while small frogs rumbled anonymously in the darkness below the porch. The single streetlight cast its fire-colored light into the humid air, which refracted it in a hellish afterglow. Unmensch. It's a German word that means beast. Well, literally, I guess it means inhuman or abhuman, but the general way that people use it in English is like beast or monster. I think abhuman is the best translation. It is just a general idea of being completely alien, totally anti-human. The antithesis of everything that's good or redeemable about people. Oh, I thought at first it was like the opposite of Amish. I mean, you did say it was an Amish term, right? I said that when I spent the summer roofing houses with the Amish crews, they told me about it. It's not really Amish per se, but the Anabaptists around here believe in it, or some of them do. It's a Central European superstition, I think. They have versions of it in Switzerland and Italy and Germany and Austria. I read about it somewhere when I was doing some research for a report in my anthropology class last year. It was supposed to be over a superstition or urban legend from our hometown, so I picked the unmensch. You're kidding me. Why would a college class spend time talking about superstitions? Mark was leaning back in a folding chair looking out over his parents' front yard. He rocked his head a little and took a sip of a Long Island iced tea from a plastic cup. It's culture. It's not fucking culture. It's delusion. I mean, I'm not saying it's real or anything. Just that you can learn a lot about humans and what it means to be human from their superstitions and religions. It doesn't make it real, but I just think it's a damn waste of time to go to college to talk about the kind of shit that college was made to knock out of people's heads. Thomas angrily flicked his cigarette into a bucket filled with sand and pulled a new one out of his shirt pocket. I mean, he said while he fumbled with a lighter, I'm only a year younger than you, and I only took one semester at Ball State before I came back here and I got a job at the mill. But I'd almost say that one semester did me more good than 4 years. Mark smirked dryly and crossed his leg over his knees. I should have been careful about bringing it up around you. I'm just saying that, true or not true, studying superstitions can shed light on the human condition. Not saying that everyone needs to get born again or have the 10 Commandments hanging on their walls. This isn't even a mainstream religious story. It's got pagan roots. Bullshit. The Amish wouldn't keep pagan superstitions around. Mark's face hardened a little, and he peered uncomfortably at the ground at the base of the street lamp. He moved his hand casually, almost as if he hoped Thomas wouldn't notice, to block the bright light from the bulb. Something had seemed to stir behind the pole, low to the ground. But it was just a cat slowly moving towards something on the ground, something smaller and slower. These Amish do. The Amish in Adams County aren't like the ones on TV or in the drugstore books. They're strange people. They come from the Swiss mountains where there wasn't a lot of law and order during the Middle Ages. In the same class, I read a book on the witch trials during the 17th century, and it talked about how most of the worst trials were directed at these lonely rural communities in the mountainous regions of Europe. The Alps, the Carpathians, the Pyrenees, the Scottish Highlands. People took longer to orthodoxy Christianity there. Pagan beliefs blended with Catholicism and made these weird hybrids. Well, the Amish who lived in this area come from the Alps, not Bavaria, and they don't even speak the same language as other Amish. It's a Swiss folk kind of German, but that isn't even close to Pennsylvania Dutch. Not by Amish standards anyway. So yeah, the Amish around here have some strange notions. Thomas's forehead was still stiff, and his eyes glowered under his eyebrows. Whatever, he said after taking another long pull and letting the smoke dissolve into the steamy night air. I don't want to get into this with you tonight. Not after you just got back from school. Mark peered into his cup, tapped the bottom, set it down, and stood up, walking across the porch to a small cooler. He dug through the ice and pulled out 2 Long Island iced teas, handing one to Thomas and opening the other before sitting down. I know what your feelings are about me getting a degree in theology. An oxymoron if you've ever said one. I'm a curious person. But what's there to be curious about? It's like getting a degree in fairy tales. People study those too. But they don't think they're real, man. I don't know what I think is real. I just enjoy learning about what other people think. Well, you know, I think it's a waste of time and brain cells, so there's no point in reminding you. No. So tell me about the Unmensch and get that bottle of Jack before we get that it's here. Mark nodded and reached under his chair where the bottles sat unopened. He poured them each a finger into plastic cups, and they slowly swallowed the whiskey before returning to the Long Islands. It was getting close to 11. The heat of the dead sun was radiating vicariously from the pavement, sidewalks, and house siding. A barely perceptible chill had begun in the soil, coming up between the grass blades and manifesting in a bank of dim vapor that hung 3 inches above the ground. Well, like I was saying, the Amish who were roofing with me told me about it, and I looked it up in the library at school later and found out more. It's an unlucky thing to see, a kind of black shuck. What? It's a British demon hound, A huge dog with blazing eyes that foretells your death when you see it. It's what inspired Conan Doyle to write The Hound of the Baskervilles. The legend in the beginning of the book is real. It's just tweaked to work with the plot. Okay. Well, the Unmensch isn't the same as Black Shuck. It doesn't just appear to people randomly. It's supposed to start to follow them a long time before it shows up. And it's not an enormous hound. It's a coyote, a small black coyote with dead white eyes, sightless, white eyes that glow like two pearl buttons in candlelight. And, well, that's the idea, that it attaches itself to people who it has sympathy with. A sympathy. Yeah, people it sees itself in. People who are unmenschlich themselves. People who are somehow disconnected from the people, the community, the culture around them. People, outcasts or rebels who haven't or can't plug into the general stream of humanity. And it starts showing up to them. Supposedly. Okay, then what? They die. Somehow it overtakes them, the idea that it's inside them to begin with, or that they're inside it, and that it's not so much a haunting as a recognition. Sometimes they commit suicide or drink themselves to death or get into fights with groups of violent men. In the Middle Ages, a lot of times they would just wander off to the woods and never come back. Some of the more modern urban legends have them overdosing or driving off the road at night. Anyway, that's what I was thinking of when you asked me what was making me nervous on the walk back from the restaurant. Good Lord. You have to be shitting me. You thought you saw a ghost dog. Mark smiled and stretched his bare feet towards the street. It's not a dog. It's a coyote. Even stupider. On both accounts. Whatever, man. You know, we'll always be buds. Have been for 16 years. But I just never thought that one of us would actually get out of this shitty town, actually go to college, end up being somehow backwards and superstitious for it. I mean, I don't think college is the only place to get an education. Look at me. I mean, I still live here, still drink here, still work here, and I'm still a critically thinking, libertarian atheist. But you go off to a good liberal state school in a fucking New York, and you're the one who comes back talking about ghost dogs. I'll be damned if I get you, man. But we'll always be buds. Mark smiled to himself and nodded. I'm glad for that. Mark had finished his iced tea and was pouring both of them 2 fingers of whiskey. That should probably be the last of it, because Thomas had to walk home and they could save the rest of the bottle for the next weekend. He swilled his cup and took a slow sip, looking half anxiously under the streetlight. But nothing was there. Probably he hadn't seen anything following them on the way back from the rib joint, but his mind had been active all night. It was close to the end for this friendship. He could feel it. He had felt it before. This was the dry rot that grew worse with every passing summer. It had taken one summer before he had stopped hearing from Tanner and Stephen and Ty. 2 summers before he had outgrown Luke and Carter. And now he felt the gulf widening between him and his oldest friend. There were 3 or 4 others from his hometown that he still saw, but not with Thomas. Thomas had never liked them, and it was just one more chink in the growing chasm between them. It was as if he felt that when Thomas inevitably walked off his porch, down his sidewalk, and into the thick of the night air, he would be swallowed forever by space. Thomas was about to light his 5th cigarette when he suddenly dropped the Zippo with a loud start. The lighter clattered to the porch with a clang, the wick still flaming. Mark darted over and picked it up before a fire started and looked up at his friend. His eyes went to his hands, where he expected to see a blister forming from a burn. But it was his face that seemed to communicate a more accurate story. His eyes were pinched in a kind of furious shock, and his teeth were set at resistant fear. Something behind Mark had startled him. Mark's own stomach now tightened. But it was such a silly thought, and why should he? just as fervent a believer in science and reason as Thomas, be concerned by what his friend had seen looming over his shoulder. What was it? What did you see? Fuck, man. Nothing. Whiskey in my head, just some kid moving around in a weird way across the street, I guess. Some kind of sick kid. Oh, why? Mark asked, his voice croaking. Why sick? What do you mean? Just the way he was moving. It had to be a he, some sick perverted kid. Shouldn't be moving like that. Fucking weird, man. Now, Mark was wondering if mixing the whiskey with the iced teas had put him in this jittery state of mind, but he didn't want Thomas to see him startled by what was likely a strange play of the shadows from the streetlight. If Thomas realized how truly nervous this made him, their friendship was almost certain to end then and there. The last strand of respect would snap, and another old friend would walk away from him. But there was something about Thomas's reaction that made him feel slightly less self-conscious. His eyes were still scouring the dark street running perpendicular to the one in front of them, and Mark wondered if his own fear might be forgiven, maybe even shared. But before he could ask Thomas anything else, his friend slung back his whiskey, successfully lit a new cigarette, and started for the sidewalk. Hey man, I gotta be getting back. It's pretty late considering I got tomorrow, so I'm gonna split here if you don't mind. No problem, buddy. Do you want to come over next Friday? I was thinking about burning those moving boxes in the fire pit and having a couple people over. Thomas stopped without turning around. The cigarette bobbed as he talked, sending blue mushrooms into the black air where they shone in the streetlight. Who are you thinking? I don't know. I'll tell you when I get an idea. Let me know if you think any of your work friends would like to come. Thomas stood quietly for a moment, then nodded and stuffed his hands in his pockets, making his way down the sidewalk. Across the street, under the street lamp, and then beyond it as he faded into the darkness, transmuting into a shadow. The fireflies had all since disappeared, and all Mark could see of Thomas was the ember end of his cigarette, like a single red firefly, slowly fading down the street, blinking in regular spasms of dull light, until it finally had gone too far by itself and was engulfed in nothingness. Mark went to bed that night and awoke early in the morning, his pillow drenched in sweat, his sleep crowded with nightmares. The light coming through the window was ashy pink, and he decided against trying to go back to sleep. He showered, dressed, and spent the morning applying to research jobs and writing articles for the half-dozen blogs he worked for. When the day warmed into noon, he went to work at the Alpine Rose, his town's sole coffee shop. And when noon faded to evening, he folded his apron and began what he feared would be another lonely walk home. But it wasn't lonely. The summer air was pregnant with the perfume of flower beds, sparkling with bird calls, and even the purple afterglow of twilight seemed to have more in common with the faded warmth of day than the hastening gloom of night. He walked home lazily, passing a former teacher here, a high school acquaintance there, waving cheerily to each other and exchanging kind words. It was not the sort of evening that he'd expected, almost as if a series of filters had been lifted from his eyes, revealing a world of warmth and connection where he had anticipated one of cold loneliness. He returned to his room, answered emails, read the news, listened to some music, and fell asleep. It wasn't until 4 a.m. when he woke up. He knew immediately that he was not alone, and instinctively turned his head towards the far corner of his room, behind his right shoulder, where he saw the curled shape of a human being. It was bent over itself in a strange manner, freakish, unnecessary, awkwardly, almost as if it had been placed in a dehydrator and sucked dry of moisture, curled into a hollow husk. Its black hair and beard framed the white skin of its face, but the hollows of its eyes stood out even more starkly, empty and dead. Then why did it move? What animated its weightless legs and bony arms? With weak, fragile motions, it started from the dusk and walked towards the window on the other side of Mark's bed. The white flesh now glowed in the moonlight, unwholesome and mottled, unpleasant to remember or describe. It seemed to be the shape of a small man who had grown even smaller through the natural loss of his body fluids. A dried raisin hovering over Mark's bed, stretching out his arms which cracked and creaked like old leather being stretched out of a familiar shape, while the murky sockets forbade any recognizable expression. The bearded face seemed to wrinkle into a pleading grin, emphasized by the reaching fingers, the skin around which had hardened and dried into a transparent crust. But before Mark could accept or reject the supplication, and he later shivered at the thought of what reaction either response would have warranted, the face twisted spasmodically, as if suddenly possessed by a new wearer, and the tangle of limbs fell to the floor where the figure scuttled around on all fours, whelping eagerly like a wild dog. Something fundamental seemed to change about the shape. He watched with revulsion as it backed away from him with newfound flexibility. On the floor, he could only see the white skin of the bearded face, now invigorated with a horrified expression, but could tell by its movements that it was backing away from him like an obedient dog across the room and out the door into the hallway. All he could see in the darkness, though, was the white mask of horror slowly being dragged, sucked into the darkness of the hallway, receding as if failing irretrievably down the shaft of a bottomless well. Mark would later not be able to remember if he fell back asleep, if he had ever woken up. Was it a dream or a memory? Or if he had stayed awake until dawn. He had the impression of this experience branded into his consciousness, but had no memory of the preceding 4 hours. Only when he arrived at the Alpine Rose to open at 8 did he return to his own mind, and he wasn't sure if he should be horrified, confused, angry, or forewarned. What had happened was a mystery, but it seemed to mean something to the deep, hidden organ of his spirit, and he reacted to it, not as if it were a nightmare or a narrow escape from a horror, but as if a friend had whispered in his ear a warning. His nerves were steady and alert, his vestigial animal soul prickled with paranoid sensitivity. And then the morning passed into noon, the noon passed into evening, and the night brought him a long and delicious sleep, uninterrupted and, so far as he knew, unaccompanied. The days faded into the nights, and the nights grew into days, and an entire week passed before Mark had a reason to remember his nocturnal visitor. He spent the mornings and afternoons working at the Alpine Rose, and spent the middays and evenings writing and applying for work. During his lunch break on Friday, he heard back from a museum in Louisville that was interested in hiring him as a researcher and guide. The pay was not tremendously impressive, but it came with insurance and the possibility of advancement if he was willing to work hard and commit himself to their mission. It was a coup for an underemployed theology major living with his parents, and he quickly agreed to an interview the following Monday. He cheerily returned to work at 3 and came home to Thomas on his porch at 9 o'clock. The days were getting longer. The sky was still a vivid melange of plum, pink, and scarlet, with the heavy blues of night steadily coming in from the east like a gathering storm. "It's good to see you, man." Thomas's face was somehow more pinched and gaunt than it had been at their last parting. He seemed anxious and out of place. "Who's all coming?" "To what?" "Your fire." "Oh, damn. I completely forgot about that. You still down?" Well, I might actually need those moving boxes still, but my dad cut down some dead limbs from the silver maple out back, and we can use those. Moving boxes? Well, that's what I was going to burn before. But, hey, I think I might be getting a job in Louisville. Thomas's eyes seemed to grow narrower. Being a priest? The degree is in theology, but that doesn't make me ordained, so no, as a researcher for the museum. Like the Creation Museum? No, man, I'm not like that, you know? I might be more interested in the non-material part of the human experience, but it doesn't mean I think fossils are a trick or that evolution is a deep state conspiracy. No, it's like a history museum. They like my research background, and I'm going to interview with them on Monday. I help them catalog documents and transcribe letters if I get it. Thomas seemed to be restraining a glare. He looked off into the eastern sky, then quickly turned to the ground. I'm not working at the mill no more. Why? Layoffs. Ah, shit, man. I'm sorry. It's fine. I think Jenny can get me a job at the bar. They need work there. Everyone needs work around here. That's true. Yeah, everyone's hiring, just not the mill or the factories out of town. I could go back to Subway, too. Or the Alpine Rose if I get the Louisville job. I'll tell Glenda that they should consider you before they post it. Thomas looked up at him with a snake-like glare, like a sentry at the Alamo watching a casual visitor pack up and ride off to 5-week stay at a health resort in the Catskills. I'll be fine. We doing this fire? Mark nodded and went inside for a lighter and newspaper. The backyard faced the very outskirts of the town. A few houses' lights peered through the dusk. But behind them stretched a relatively unbroken field of corn, girded in by rows of monstrous shaggy trees in the distance. A shallow pit in the middle of the yard was ringed with large stones dug up by farmers and thrown in the ditches. Mark's dad had carefully turned them into a tidy ring, and over time their inside-facing portions had grown black with soot, while the outside-facing halves still gleamed in shades of rose and umber. Mark made a pile of newspaper balls in the bottom of the charred pit, leaned a dozen or so twigs and sticks in a teepee around the pile, and steadied 5-foot-long sections of the maple branch in a larger teepee around the hole. While Thomas watched quietly from a lawn chair, he lit the paper and watched the flickering tails of flame turn into a snapping fire. Mark reached beside him and picked up the weeks-old bottle of whiskey, still 3/4 full, and handed the bottle to his friend, while he settled into the chair beside him. The two watched the flames solemnly, each keeping an eye to the darkness that prowled around them. High in the purple sky above them was Venus, lonely and isolated in the as-yet starless sky, drifting like a solitary firefly, fading into colorless space. You could go back to school, you know. The question came out of the silence like an uninvited guest. I'm still paying off the debt from the semester I took. That was 2 years ago. I didn't make a lot at the mill. I won't make more at the bar. You can get scholarships. And do what? Study science. Study physics. Listen, I like watching YouTube videos about science, but I'm terrible at math, and I don't like writing papers. No, it's a hobby, not a career. I'll be fine. It'd be kind of fitting if you had your degree in physics, and I had mine in metaphysics. You know, have you ever thought you like that stuff because you can afford to wonder about things that aren't material? That's all I have. Maybe when I have a job sitting on my ass all day, I'll get bored enough to wonder about the afterlife and the spirit world and ghost dogs. But until then, I'm just worried about paying my rent, not getting my truck repoed. Maybe that's why I'm the atheist and you're wasting your time thinking about non-existent universe outside this one. Besides which, maybe that's the last thing I want to worry about. Mark shifted in his chair and looked over at his friend. The last comment croaked in his voice, and in the firelight, he saw that his eyes were large and shining, like a deer who can hear the hounds afield. What do you mean, hell? or something like it. Maybe not hell the place, but hell the experience. Experience? Yeah. Oh, like, maybe it's not the thing you go to after you die, or if you've been bad. Maybe it's the thing that lives in you and eats you up and sleeps in your bed and follows you to work. Maybe it's not a punishment. Maybe it's a condition. What, like sickness? Like an infection? His eyes were no longer on the fire. They looked beyond the fire, and his voice came from the side of his mouth now, as if his attention was divided between Mark and something on the other side of the fire. Something moving back and forth, slowly and intentionally, like a lion guarding its meal. Mark grabbed the whiskey and took a long gulp of it, hoping to relax his nerves and maybe bring the light of humor into his twilight mind, but it didn't seem to help. What do you keep looking? And then suddenly, he thought he saw it. Small, oddly proportioned, hybrid, dwarfish, misshapen. But no. It was maybe a cat chasing prey. Maybe. No, it was nothing. Just the morphing shadows of the fire moving erratically in the breeze. He looked off to the side. There were no fireflies in the grass and no stars in the sky. The night was deep and black, and it rained unchecked. I wish you would maybe consider moving from here. Maybe go to Fort Wayne or Indy. Find something bigger and better to do with your time. I think... Thomas's voice came out the side of his mouth in a dull whisper. What did you say that thing was called again? That Amish legend. The Unmensch? Yeah, the Unmensch. What did you say that means in English? Mark looked around them and was surprised at how dark it had gotten. The street lamps at either end of the street seemed domed in brown glass. The lights of the neighbors' houses all seemed to be off, snuffed. Something moved behind them, something small and light. The cat, he thought. Something with 4 legs, something low to the ground. It literally means unhuman, but you could call it beast or monster or creature. What did you say you preferred? You preferred something. I think I said abhuman. It was a good translation. Or anti-human. There didn't seem to be any grasshoppers in the trees or frogs in the fields. The whooshing, snapping voice of the fire was the only company that Mark felt in his soul. It's part of the spirit, you think? It's an urban legend. What do you think? I think it's a superstition. Cultures come up with these narratives to explain a psychological state or a part of the human experience. They invent an idol or a god or Santa Claus to help illustrate a chapter in the human condition that they can't explain. What if they didn't invent them? Said Thomas. What the fuck do you mean? What if they've seen them? What if they dreamed about them? What if they're part spiritual and part material, a combination of the two worlds? The fire seemed to flare and grow whiter. Mark struggled to see anything outside of it. It was so bright and white, and the darkness was so exclusive and opaque. You don't believe in a spiritual world. You do. I'm curious about it. I never experienced it. I'm just a student, not a damn shaman. What if the Unmensch is part of both worlds? What if it can live in them simultaneously? Not like a ghost or burglar, but something in between. What? A burgling ghost? Mark had expected his words to knock sense into his friend. Maybe even bring out a chuckle, like the stupidity of hearing Thomas reference his interest in ghost dogs, diluting Black Shook and the Unmensch to 2 stupid, silly words. But Thomas turned to him, and his eyes fluttered with shock and fear. Yes, a burgling ghost. A thing that can break into your room and break into your head at the same time. Yes. His eyes bulged piteously from his white, gaunt face, and the rims of his eyelids gleamed red from what could have been sleepless nights, habitual crying, or a combination of the two. Mark suddenly recognized the great vulnerability of his friend and felt an electric fusing of his own spirit and body. The pain and isolation of his soul now converted into physical agony as his hands shook and tears started to seep from his eyes. What's happening to you? How can I help? I want to help. Don't shut me out, man. What can I do? But at that moment, the tallest log collapsed with a crash and took the smaller logs with it in a sudden shower of orange beads. In the momentary darkness before the fire recovered its breath, Mark saw something dark and angular sitting on the other side of the fire. Something that had been perfectly covered by the lapping wedges of flame before its collapse. In the brief seconds before the fire rose again, in the red glare of the embers, he saw a gaunt black dog sitting authoritatively on its skeletal haunches. The shaggy fur hung over its emaciated form in mossy tatters, and its lower jaw laid on its lean chest, as if held to the upper skull by only a few strips of muscle, giving the impression that the animal was either screaming or laughing. But its dead white eyes, like two clouded pearls, gave no sign of its true emotion, as they glowed wildly in the flash of the falling logs. In the span of a second, it seemed to melt into the dark, without making a motion of its ragged head. God, that dog has to have rabies. Fuck, man. Let's go inside and get my dad's rifle. Someone needs to shoot the face off that dog. But Thomas didn't respond to his friend's shock. He seemed to have been staring through the fire into those pearly eyes the entire time. It's not a dog. Dogs don't have tails like that or ears like that. That's a coyote. But it was black. Coyote is a grayish-brown. There aren't any such things as... He suddenly felt the full force of what he was about to say and stopped his words. It was a freak. A disgusting freak. Sometimes they breed with dogs. A black lab bred with a coyote. It should be crushed or put to death. Its eyes. Mark stopped again. Thomas was staring into the distance towards the street lamp. Beyond the street lamp and into the shadows. His eyes were wide and unmoving, pleading even, as if he were conducting a mute negotiation with something across the street in the shadows. I'm sorry I ever brought up the unmensch. You're right. This is a material world. There's no sense in even discussing superstitions, not even to joke about them. Why should we sit here and talk about whether purple dragons exist and when there's no proof of them? You were right. Let's stick to science from now on. I'm glad the job is with the museum and not a seminary. A career in facts and reason will be good for me. I've been living in a purely speculative world and it's rubbed off on you. I can see that I've had a bad impact on you this week. I'm sorry about that. Let's go inside. I'll get that rifle just in case that dog comes here again. Let's go inside and watch TV. Thomas's unblinking eyes welled over, and he stood up unsteadily. The brown glow of the street lamp did little to cut through the dense murk behind it. No light, Mark thought with a shiver, could illuminate its secrets. Thomas didn't hear him, though, because he slowly rose from his lawn chair and took a wobbly step away from the fire. Hey, man, where you going? His eyes were fixed on the darkness on the other side of the street lamp, which suddenly seemed to take on the role of a border marker, a checkpoint between two worlds. I should go home. I've had too much to drink, and I need to apply to jobs in the morning. Don't go. I have to. Something furious and impatient was boiling inside of Mark. He resented Thomas's weakness, his lack of spirit, lack of imagination, lack of will. Damn you, you don't. I do. You don't have to do anything. It's not outside of me. It's part of me. It is me. I see myself. It's not an infection. It's a cancer. It's not an invasion. It's a rebellion. What the hell does any of that mean? Stop walking away, man. The fire is almost dead. Mark turned and saw that the streetlight was indeed the only remaining source of light around them. The red molten glow of the expiring embers were growing duller by the moment. The cornfields were now indistinguishable from the cloudy night sky. Dead, black space bloomed and yawned around them, impossible to measure or understand or cull. What the hell was making everything so dark? You can come inside with me. Stay the night. I don't feel too good. I want to go home. You're not going home. You're going to that. I don't know what you mean. I need to go. I need to. I can't stay anymore. I can't be here anymore. Why can't you just come inside for a few minutes? Have some ginger ale and crackers if you aren't feeling so hot. Thomas's unblinking eyes followed something's movement in the distance, crossing back and forth, then seeming to sit still. Perhaps in the middle of the sidewalk that he was now standing on, the sidewalk that led across the street and into the distance. I don't have anything left to do here. I should go home instead. Mark squinted into the opaque murk into which his friend seemed destined to be enfolded. Was something sitting there waiting? Was it just the fire hydrant on the curb? Was this an excuse? Or was it a change in attitude, a shift from aimlessness to responsibility that he should support? It didn't seem to matter, because Thomas didn't wait for a response or a parting gesture. He floated off down the sidewalk, limping towards the intersection with a steady, measured pace, like a man being marched to the writ of his execution. He passed under the large paternal trees that sheltered Mark's family home, momentarily disappearing in their shadows, before emerging at intervals into the pools of gloomy light that poured between their twisted boughs. Mark felt two impulses struggling within him, one human and gentle, which longed to rush down the sidewalk and drag Thomas inside by the arm, to touch, keep, and protect his fading friend. And another, animal and self-interested, which breathed a sigh of relief at the departure of this plagued companion. It exulted in his retreat in the same way that Mark's ancestors had beaten their leprous companions away from their food and fire, thrown out the weak members of their camps, and chased away the maimed comrades whom they knew would only slow them down and attract predators. A part of this vestigial selfishness sighed in relief at Thomas's departure. But the human spirit in him watched with awe and regret as he passed under the streetlight on the corner and faded into the black space behind it, like a necklace dropping into a still pond, where it could be watched sinking through increasing curtains of darkness until it was impossible to see and impossible to recover. When Thomas finally had been swallowed into the dusk, nothing could be seen from where he had faded. Nothing, except for two pinpricks of dull white light, the dead, marbled glow of reflected moonlight, perhaps. Or of two sickly fireflies hovering side by side. With a sudden, almost immediate turn, however, the two lights were doused, leaving nothing but space, illimitable, featureless, and unknown. Mark had intended to visit his friend the following morning, but was prevented by a high temperature. Maybe Thomas hadn't been making excuses. There seemed to have been a powerful contagion in the air that night, and Mark was bedridden all weekend, sleeping fitfully for 2 days before his fever broke and he felt well enough to stand and move around. But it was the day of his interview now, and he had a 4-hour drive to Louisville. He was able to move it forward from the morning to the afternoon, but there was no time to check on his friend, other than to report his sickness, and to check on Thomas's condition through a few brief texts. The interview was at 2, and by the time it was over, having gone predictably well, he was feeling healthy enough to explore what seemed to be his new city. By the time he arrived at his hotel room later that night, he found a missed call from the museum. offering him the job. He quickly became drunk with the excitement of the next stage in his life that he didn't notice Thomas's text asking him to call as soon as he could. When he finally did see it, he was in the middle of the apartment hunting and assumed that the need had probably passed. It had been 2 days since the text had been sent, and after a week, his parents drove down with all his clothes and luggage in their van. He wouldn't return to his hometown until Christmas, and even then it was a short evening spent at home before the entire family decamped for his grandparents' farm in Ohio, where they spent Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and Boxing Day. He drove back to Louisville from Dayton, and he didn't see his parents' home again until Easter. He was reminded of Thomas abruptly when his parents gloomily mentioned that he was a missing person, that he had apparently been evicted from his apartment sometime around Halloween because of a drug habit that proved impossible for the landlord to tolerate, that he'd been arrested twice that autumn, that he'd been released from jail sometime in January, and that he hadn't been heard of or seen since then. Thomas's mom had been dead for years, and his dad, an alcoholic veteran drawing Social Security, was barely more settled than his son. So what little search there was for him hadn't been particularly spirited. Indeed, it was more of a general awareness that if someone should see him, they should tell him that he was being looked for. Other than that, no one was worrying too much about a 23-year-old opioid addict who had chosen to step outside of the town's social parameters. It was as if he had walked beyond the city limits and had been erased from the collective consciousness of the people who had watched him grow up. It was as if he had broken some unspoken code and had been banished from the memories of his neighbors and classmates. The shunning spirit of the old order Amish still lurked in the DNA of the town's Mennonites, and while they drove cars, wore shirts, and had internet connections, their souls were quick to shun and slow to forgive the weak members of their parish. The search continued in their words, but their hearts had long ago delivered him to the demons as a sacrifice for their community's greater good. Eject the sinner, shun the outsider, watch the borders and repel the invaders. The winter that year was unusually cold and vicious, even for northern Indiana. Heavy frost kept the ground flinty well into April, and the farmers grumbled about it to anyone who had the patience to listen. Finally, 3 weeks after Easter, the temperatures rose above 40 degrees, and the spring sun thawed the icy soil, breathing life into the gray earth and hope into the farmers' tired hearts. It was about a week after the tractors took to the fields with their tillers that one Amish man, Ernest Eicher, who had paused his team of horses to move a heavy rock out of the way, noticed the revolting smell coming from the culvert under his driveway. The earth was drenched, black and heavy with rain, and the scorching sun drew the moisture into the air, which was thick and pungent. Eicher's shirt clung to his skin and his red face streamed with perspiration. As he urged the horses on, cutting through the dead earth like a surgeon at a post-mortem, the stench hung in the steam, which seemed to magnify its range and pungency, and the howling whir of the flies hadn't escaped his notice. Removing his sweat-bleached hat, he reined in the horses and took a hesitant step towards the stench. Something was rustling in the shadows there. He stopped his breath with a jolt when a pair of black birds suddenly shot out of the darkness, wings smacking like crumbled paper, and disappeared into the twisted oak whose shadow blanketed the ditch from the sun. He followed their flight and felt his brain reel. The tree was bristling with wings, black with ravens. They looked watchful, impatient, and hungry. Eicher called his sons Levi and Jacob to tend to the horses and keep an eye on him as he descended into the ditch from where the odor was emanating. They barely kept an eye on the horses, all the time watching their father while breathing out of their mouths. When Ernest returned, his face was gray and his beard dripped with traces of vomit. They sent his daughter, Rosemary, with a speedy two-wheeled cart to town, where she summoned the police and the ambulance. The remains had been chillingly preserved by the winter weather, but the spring thaw had begun its work, and the jellied eyes had been quickly eaten out by peckish crows. What remained was the emaciated, bent corpse of a bearded man with deathly white skin, tight and membranous over the jutting bones. He didn't carry an ID, and while he sported a black beard, the Amish assured the police that none of their number had been missing. This, and the presence of a mustache on his mummified lip, assured the authorities that he was an Englisher. After a short interview, Ernest returned to tilling his field, but he didn't leave the scene of the discovery behind him. A week later, word was spreading from one Swiss-German homestead to another that Ernest had seen something when he descended into the ditch and peered into the dusky culvert. He had, they said, seen a coyote crouching beside the corpse, peering into its hollow sockets. This naturally was no strange sight. A coyote could be expected, as a carrion scavenger, to take interest in a putrefied body. What was disturbing was its princely authoritative attitude, thoughtful rather than eager, calm rather than ravenous, and its black pelt. It was black, Ernest said, that made the shadow around it seem blazing with light, a black that consumed and refused to give back. He, the corpse, Ernest supposed, might have been under the power of the Unmensch. The body was never claimed, although some suspected it might be the body of the boy who had gone missing in January. But his father had died over Easter weekend, and there were no other relatives to take interest in his recovery. So the vagrant was buried in the potter's field of the Mennonite cemetery under a small stone with 3 numbers on it. The numbers I have forgotten. Even though Mark never heard about the rumors that swirled around the Amish gatherings, or the burial of the vagrant, he still thought from time to time about the night that Thomas dissolved from sight, how he had walked into the murk and disappeared. He had been seen many times since then, of course, had his fingerprints and mugshot taken, but for Mark, that was the last sight he had had of his friend before he followed whatever thing inside of him led him to whatever place he ended up. Where was he now? Panhandling in Fort Wayne? Tending bar in Toledo? Going to a community college in Terre Haute? Driving down a ribbon of highway in Nebraska? Or standing in a soup kitchen in Kalamazoo? Mark knew that only one fate could be real. All the others were imaginings, but one of them, maybe one that he hadn't thought of, was real, and he could not be changed. He thought of the haggard phantom that pleaded to him in the moonlight, but then he thought better of pondering this vision, and he tried to forget it. He shut it out of his mind, surrendering to work, to relationships, to alcohol, but to no avail. He would continue to see it, standing at the foot of his bed quietly, patiently, or being dragged away into the murk, silently, submissively, in his nightmares, for the rest of his own abbreviated and bedeviled life. But Ernest Eicher didn't forget what he saw, and the Amish people prayed for the soul of the eyeless thing he had found in the culvert, nor could he forget the shaggy black beast that had been squatting in front of the rotting heap, gazing deeply into its gutted sockets. He hadn't seen its eyes. God, sei Gilbert und Gebendheit, he said here, with a tremble, before whispering, God, in his mercy, here, protected his humble servant from seeing the Auge der Unmensch. with his own eyes clenched in prayer. But he was sure that they would have been dead and white, like two pearl buttons glinting in candlelight, like two fireflies fading into the colorless vacuum of space.
The Owl by Aaron Shotwell, narrated by Otis Jiry. My name is Jake Whitaker. I turned 90 years old a week ago today. It's funny. You go through life knowing that old age will catch up to you, and you still wonder where that time went once it does. At least, that's what the other folk around the retirement home say. I know exactly where my time went. I've seen the world from many perspectives. Everything from the rose-tinted glasses of youth to an old man's tired cynicism. I've learned a great deal of things in my day, but even for someone of my years, some things will always remain a mystery. There are things in life you just get comfortable with, even without an explanation. You just accept them, and you even come to expect them. You stop to think about them every now and then, wondering if there's an answer. But you eventually stop trying. It is what it is, no changing it. No need to. For me, that thing has been around for as long as I can remember. I've walked through life with a very strange companion. My grandfather died in the fall of 1931. It wasn't anything tragic. It was just his time. He survived until he eventually became senile. His life was already over as far as I was concerned. Sure, I was sad to see him go, just the same as any other little boy would be. But I watched him fade away, and I knew he wasn't my grandfather anymore. He just wasn't in there. He was gone. So I didn't cry at his funeral. I had done plenty of that once I realized that he had forgotten my name. I just said my goodbyes and washed my hands of it. I did a lot of remembering, though. I remembered all of the things about him that mattered to me. I remembered all of the quarters that he pulled from behind my ear, all of the walks in the park, and the short games of catch before he'd start complaining about back pain. You know, the simple things that made him my grandpa. I especially remembered his stories. He had a million of them. Most of them far-fetched and funny, and all punctuated with his own laughter. He liked to think that he was the next Mark Twain, but he wasn't as witty as all that. He was just a silly old codger. Still, we all liked to listen to him ramble on, and that was enough for him. The stories I recall most, though, were not the silly anecdotes. In fact, they weren't even stories, not really. They were more like obscure references of the kind you might hear about La Llorona, the Tooth Fairy, or the Boogeyman. The ones I grew up with were about the owl. There was a difference between the owl and those other creatures, though. All of these other creatures you hear about, they're urban legends because there's always a story behind them. Not the owl. Grandpa never told us what the owl was, where it came from, or what it did. The owl was just the owl. The references were never consistent either. We didn't know if we were supposed to fear it or feel safe because of it. One night, he'd tell us not to be afraid of monsters under the bed because the owl would keep them away. Another day, he'd tell us not to tell fibs or eat candy before dinner because the owl was watching. My older brother, Jeffrey, who passed away 5 years ago, God rest his soul, stopped believing in the owl after Grandpa died. He just wrote it off as another of the old man's tall tales. I believed, though. I had always believed, and I knew for sure after the wake. Everyone took turns walking by his open casket to say their final goodbyes, commenting on how peaceful he looked and saying he was in a better place, the usual remarks for the occasion. And then it was my turn. I was only 9 years old, and I still hadn't reached my growth spurt, so I had to stand on my toes a bit to see. The first thing I saw was Grandpa's face in profile, expressionless and pale, and it choked me up the way you'd expect. It was also my first experience with death, so I was much too disturbed to look for long. Then I saw something that no one else seemed to notice. Or, if they did, they didn't make any mention of it. It was tucked away discreetly between the sleeve of his coat and the casket's white silk lining, protruding no more than an inch between them. Just enough to grab my attention. It was a feather. It was long and beautiful. A tuft of snowy white down at the base of the quill, pure silver white with faint stripes of gray along the vein. It seemed so deliberately placed, but I hadn't seen anyone else put it there, and I had been nervously watching the line of mourners move ahead of me the entire time. I almost reached for it, but I knew it wouldn't be proper. For a moment, I forgot about my grandpa. The feather was all I could see, and I felt numb. Nobody else saw it. Nobody would believe me if I told them, but I knew. I knew where it came from. It belonged to the owl. That night was a restless one for me, the first of many. It was a long time before I could sleep comfortably again, because that was the night when it first paid me a visit, in the moonlight. I could just make it out. It was perched on a tree branch just outside my bedroom window, a large and striking great horned owl. Entirely silver in appearance. Even its beak and talons were sort of a dull gray. I couldn't see its eyes as they were sunken in dark hollows. Its crown feathers hung at a lazy slant, and it didn't make the fidgety gestures you would expect from a bird. Its only movement came from an occasional slight twitch, or a light rustling of its feathers in the breeze. It never moved an inch, never made a sound, and it never looked away. It stared through my window directly at me, the entire night. I've seen it outside my window every night since. Sometimes it's on my windowsill where I can see its every feather. Sometime across the street in a neighboring tree, but always near enough where I can see it. It was there when I lost my virginity, and I lay awake staring at it as my partner for the night slept soundly in my embrace. It was there during the first night I spent in my first apartment. An apartment in downtown Los Angeles, far from where anyone would expect to see such a bird. It was there on my wedding night, watching me from the window of our new home while I held my bride close. It was there on the night my wife gave birth to our first son, and I caught a glimpse of it from the corner of my eye, staring at me from the waiting room's small window. Once I was hospitalized overnight with a terrible flu. The rooms had no windows, but I knew the owl was watching. I could feel it. It was perched outside in some nearby tree as always, peering at me through the walls. It had always been there, whether or not I think to look for it, always waiting patiently. Waiting for what I didn't know. Truth be told, I still don't know. Never a hoot nor a screech. It never moves and it never looks away. In the latter years of my life, I think I began to understand my grandfather a little better. I understood why he told us those stories, why he tried to make us believe in the owl. I found myself doing the same for my grandchildren. He must have believed, just as I had, that he wouldn't have to feel so alone if someone else knew. It was a quiet call for help. I can't tell you how much sleep I've lost to the dreadful sight of the owl over the years, but I eventually learned to cope. The thing about being haunted is that you just adjust to it, but you never really get used to it. Does that make sense? Things wouldn't seem quite right if it wasn't there as usual, but it's always nagging you in the back of your mind. You can never ignore it, even if you want to. So instead, you try to live with it. You try to make peace with it, and it becomes a routine. For a while, I even tried to interact with the owl, though I don't know what compelled me. Perhaps I wanted to understand the thing, or just to see it do something, anything, other than sit there in silence and stare at me. Maybe I'd teach it some tricks to fetch my slippers or deliver letters. The thought made me laugh. I would often approach the window to open it, thinking maybe I could pet the bird, but it always fluttered away into the shadows before I got too close. Not for long, though. It would always return once I gave it an acceptable amount of space. Sometimes I would place a chair across the window, at a distance the owl allowed, of course. I would sit in that chair and talk to the bird, telling it about my day, my troubles, and my dreams. Sometimes I'd tell it jokes, though I knew it would never laugh. I had hoped the owl was listening, or maybe that it would respond somehow. It never did. It just sat perfectly still, as always, watching me patiently. The owl has been my strange companion, even during these final days of my life. It has never left me, no matter how much I wish that it would. I've been sick lately, and I don't have much time left. The nurses know it. The other residences know it, and I think the owl knows it too. Since I became ill, around the time of my birthday last week, its behavior has changed. It has begun to move, an anxious little shuffle, and it tilts its head from time to time in that impossible way unique to an owl. I can see its eyes now, dull amber beads and pupils wide with anticipation. I think I've even seen it smiling, if you can imagine an owl's lipless version of the expression. I dare not imagine what it means, though I think I can guess. I can see it outside my window, even as I write this story. I sat down at this table to tie up any loose ends, to go over my last will and testament one more time, and maybe write a few letters to loved ones before I lose the chance. Instead, I choose to write about the owl. I just want someone, even if only one person, to know the truth. In the end, I only have one question on my mind. Will someone find the feather in my casket too? I hope it isn't my grandson. I hope he didn't believe the stories. Or he may be the owl's next obsession. The Petting Zoo by Peter de Niverville, narrated by Otis Jiry. At first, Johnson thought it was a joke. Speeding down the country road, the crude sign was only a blur, but it was that one word. Slowing down, he swung the Lexus onto the paved shoulder. In the rearview mirror, he could see it clearly. The sign was tacked to a stick that was stuck in the ground just beyond the paved shoulder. Shifting the powerful car into reverse, Johnson rammed the accelerator down. The tires squealed and loose gravel flew as he tore back up the road. Screeching to a halt, Johnson stared at the faded handwriting. Ellsworth's famous spider petting zoo, 5 miles next right. Spiders fascinated Johnson. One summer, when he was 8, a large gold and black spider had taken up residence underneath the shingles by the back door. Every morning, Johnson would gather up ants in a jar from a nest in the scrubby woods behind his house. One by one, he would drop the wriggling insects into the web. With lightning speed, the spider would spring from her hiding place and race towards the victim. Sinking her fangs into the ant, she would retreat, waiting for the poison to take effect. When the ant slowly stopped struggling, she would climb back down and delicately wrap her prey in a white shroud. This continued until one day his mother caught him. "What a cruel little boy you are," she scolded between clenched teeth as she pummeled his backside. He could still feel the shame of being spanked. Years later, in a rare moment of remorse, Johnson wondered what it was like for the ant. Trapped, helpless, waiting for the spider to return. Did they know fear or horror? Or was that something only humans experienced? The insect brain was too small, he told himself, or so he hoped. 5 miles, thought Johnson. This side trip might only add another half-hour or so to his journey. He would still have time once he got to his motel to have a shower. The dinner meeting with the buyer from the supermarket chain wasn't until 6 o'clock, and it was only 4 now. Coasting forward, Johnson scanned the road looking for the turnoff. About 100 yards ahead, he saw a lane that intersected with the highway. Flicking on his turn signal, he shot a quick glance at his watch. "If I don't find it in 15 minutes, he promised himself, I'll turn back." Accelerating smoothly, he turned onto a well-paved secondary road with deep ditches on either side. Punching the buttons on the CD player, he stretched his arms, settling back into the soft leather seat. As the throbbing beat of Queen filled the Lexus, his mood lightened, an unexpected adventure in an otherwise boring day. Johnson hated his job. Endless meetings with bad food and balding buyers. Too many drinks and too many hangovers. He was packing on the pounds, too. "I have to get back to the gym," he reminded himself. The only redeeming feature of his job was that he was good at it. Top sales rep for the last 3 years. "I should have been an actor," he told himself. "Instead, I'm selling toilet paper and tampons to these turkeys." As the needle on the speedometer crept higher and higher, the neatly kept fields and freshly painted houses became a blur. Mile after mile slipped by. Johnson felt that he and the car had become one, soaring along like a hawk on a summer breeze. But his mood soon soured. The condition of the road deteriorated. Asphalt gave way to chip seal, which gave way to gravel and finally ended up as dirt. Johnson jumped on the brakes when a huge pothole emerged in the center of the road. Cursing the delay, he checked his watch again. It was almost 5. The long drive down the country road had dulled his sense of time. "I better turn around," he cautioned himself. As he studied the road ahead, looking for a safe place to make a U-turn, he saw it. An old farmhouse set back from the road. If it hadn't been for the pothole, he would have missed it completely. By the mailbox, a freshly painted sign read, "Ellsworth's famous spider petting zoo, open year-round. All visitors welcome." This must be the place, he concluded. Carefully turning up the heavily rutted lane, Johnson wondered what he would find. Perhaps one of the locals playing a joke on the tourists, he mused. Tall grass slapped at the bottom of the car, and rusted barbed wire clung to the rotted posts that ran alongside the lane. In the untilled fields, scrubby bushes had sprung up like mushrooms. Johnson tried to imagine what the farm looked like in better days, but it was impossible. When he reached the top of the hill, the farmhouse looked even more decrepit. Blistered paint hung from wooden shingles, and there was a disturbing sag in the middle of the roof. What once had been the side garden was now occupied by tall thistles, and a mass of tangled timbers indicated the former site of the main barn. Except for the grass still being intact in the windows, the house looked abandoned. "Where is everybody?" thought Johnson. In response to his question, an old woman dressed in a black skirt and a woolen sweater stepped out the side door. She was gnarled and withered like the lone apple tree that stood in the yard. Johnson guessed she must have been at least 70, maybe even 80 years old. "What you want?" she spat. Turning off the CD player and rolling down the window, he replied, "Is this the petting zoo?" "That's what the sign says, don't it?" Ignoring her rudeness, Johnson continued, "Are you open?" "I'll get Jake. He out back chopping wood." He watched as she shuffled down a dirt path and disappeared around a corner of the house. Charming, thought Johnson. Opening the car door, he stepped out. Despite the poverty, the farm had a certain rustic appeal which reminded him of the house that he grew up in the country. But there was something odd, something missing. Where are the flies? Thought Johnson. On most farms, the low buzz of the black swarms was constant, but here there was none, except for the moaning of the wind. It was quiet. Perhaps it was the lack of the animals, he thought, or maybe it was the stiff breeze at the top of the hill that kept them at bay. Glancing at his watch, he frowned. It was after 5 o'clock. If he did not get back on the road soon, he'd be late for his appointment. Either that or skip his shower. After driving all day, Johnson did not want to skip the soothing ritual. Taking one last look around, he reached for the handle of the car door. Just then, the old woman reappeared, and behind her, an even more wizened old man, wearing faded blue overalls and a nicotine-stained undershirt. Stopping at the corner of the house, the old man spat out a long jet of chewing tobacco on the ground. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he paused momentarily to study Johnson. Speaking to the old woman, he said in a low tone, "Thought I heard a car come up." "Wants to see your spiders," she said before she turned away and went back into the farmhouse, letting the screen door slam behind her. "You want to see my spiders, young fella?" "Sure, if you're open. How much?" Looking over the Lexus, he scratched his ruddy face and said, $50. "50? That's ridiculous." Shrugging his shoulders, the old man said, "Take it or leave it. I got work to do." Then he spat out another long jet of chewing tobacco and turned to go. "I can't leave now after coming all this way," thought Johnson. Taking another quick glance at his watch, he said irritably, all right, but this better be good." The old man smirked and licked his lips as Johnson whipped out a crisp $50 bill from his wallet. Johnson did not like the old man's greedy look and hastily shoved his wallet back in his pants pocket. "Thanks," said the old man sarcastically, snatching the bill from Johnson's hand. Looking it over carefully, he folded it up neatly, stuck it in his pocket, and said, "Follow me." The old man led Johnson down an overgrown path to a shed at the back of the farmhouse. Inside, the dim glow of fluorescent tubes highlighted the dozen plywood shelves that ran along the walls. In contrast to the rest of the farm, the shed was neat, almost antiseptic in appearance. Sitting on each shelf was a glass terrarium filled with twigs and rocks. In the case closest to Johnson, a small garden spider was spinning a web in the corner. "That's an orb spider," said the old man. "I know," said Johnson, annoyed by the interruption. "You know spiders?" "A bit," replied Johnson. "I used to study them when I was a kid." "I bet you're the type that liked to feed 'em, eh? Catch bugs, drop 'em in, see what happens. Fun, ain't it?" Suddenly, Johnson was uncomfortable. "How'd you guess my secret?" he wondered. Johnson felt the warm rush of blood to his neck and ears as he started to blush. "No need to be shamed, young fella. All kids do it. It's natural." Trying to change the topic, Johnson said, "You been at this long, keeping spiders?" "Yeah, I've been at it a while. Most folks are scared of spiders. Not me. Me and spiders get along real good." Johnson turned back to watch a large black spider in another case, sucking up the half-digested slurry of its latest victims. Trying to be polite, Johnson asked, "You don't get many visitors here, being so far from the highway?" "Don't need 'em," said the old man. "This is just a sideline." Pausing for effect, he added, "I breed 'em." Johnson looked puzzled. "For the college," explained the old man. "They use them for research." "Does it pay well?" "Good enough. They don't know squat about spiders," said the old man, spitting on the floor. Johnson looked down and saw that a streak of the sticky black tobacco had splashed on his shoes. "I've been doing research of my own," said the old man proudly. "Spiders are just like any other critters. Cows, horses, dogs, they're all the same. Breed the best with the best, and you get the best, or the—" The old man's voice trailed off as he started to laugh. There was something about his tone that made Johnson uneasy. "You want to see my prize winner?" Johnson looked around. "Oh, she ain't here. I keep her in the barn. She kind of makes these critters nervous. I can't say I blames them. You want to see her?" The old man, the way he said it, the question, sounded more like a challenge. Johnson hesitated. He wanted to say no, but he could not let the old man see he was afraid. "Sure," answered Johnson. What could it be, he asked himself. A tarantula? With the old man in front, they went down a lesser-used path to a small barn behind a stand of trees that made it invisible from the farmhouse. A shiny new lock on a rusted hasp yielded to the old man's key. "I don't like kids messing with my stuff." The ancient wooden door swung wide open. Inside it was pitch black. Johnson hesitated. What was it that made him apprehensive? His mouth felt dry, and he tried to swallow. "Go on in," taunted the old man as he shoved Johnson through the door. Stumbling on the raised sill, Johnson fell to one knee, ripping his pants. "Damn it," he cursed. "There's a light switch ahead of you," the old man reassured him. "Just pull the string." The stench of moldy hay made Johnson gag. "Where is it? The spider?" he called out. "She's in the back. You can't miss her." "Where's the light?" "Right in front of you. Can't you see it?" mocked the old man. Johnson stretched out his hand. At first he could not feel anything. Then slowly, groping the air in, he caught hold of it. Johnson's heart leapt in relief. There was something strange. The line didn't feel like a string. It was sticky like a... Pulling the line, Johnson knew he had made a mistake. Something rustled in the rafters above him, and bits of straw floated down. Johnson bolted for the opening. "Enjoy yourself," cackled the old man as he slammed the door and locked it. "Let me out! Let me out!" Johnson shouted, pounding on the door. "Let me out, you old buzzard!" But it was no use. The dried-out wooden door was like iron. Pausing to catch his breath, his fists throbbing, Johnson looked around. His eyes slowly grew accustomed to the dark. What appeared to be a black chasm was in fact the side entrance to the barn. There must be another way out, he thought, but where? In the gloom, he could see that beyond the entryway was a large open space, and beyond that a boarded-up window through which thin shafts of sunlight streamed. Great! All I have to do is cross the barn, pull off one or two of those boards, and climb out, thought Johnson. Then I'll show that old man. $50. I wish I'd never stopped. Then he heard another rustle overhead, and more straw floated down. "Who is it? Who's there?" he called out. "I bet it's that old man," thought Johnson. "He thinks he's going to scare me." "Sure, you just keep that up, old man," Johnson called out again. "Let's see how much laughing you do when I bash your face in." "But first I got to get to that window. Be careful," he cautioned himself. "This barn must be full of junk. Don't want to fall down and get hurt." Despite the heat in the barn, he shivered. Licking the sweat off his upper lip, Johnson slowly picked his way across the wide wooden plank barn floor, being careful not to trip. Shadows of old machinery and tools loomed around him. A leather harness that hung from the wall looked like a hangman's noose. There was a peculiar smell, too. It reminded him of a package of chicken that he once left in the trunk of his car on a hot summer day. It was the sickly sweet scent of rotting meat. "Oh, gross," muttered Johnson. "There's a dead animal in here." In less than a minute, he had crossed the barn and was standing in front of the boarded-up window. Blocking his exit were 3 boards nailed haphazardly into the frame. Either the old man was too weak or too lazy to drive them all the way in, concluded Johnson. I can probably pull them off with my bare hands, he smiled triumphantly. The first board was half-rotted and fell apart in his hands. Light streamed in as it came away from the frame. Then he shifted his attention to the second one, the board in the middle. If he could get this one off, he could climb out easily. But this board wouldn't be so easy. It was like the old door of the barn, dried out and as tough as steel. Gripping the board with both hands, he began pulling. The nails squealed in protest, and the board started to move. Only a little bit further, grunted Johnson. The thought of throttling the old man excited him. Just a bit further, another half-inch. He could almost feel his fingers closing around the old man's scrawny neck, the eyes bulging, the tongue sticking out. Another half-inch. Then it stopped. Desperately, Johnson yanked at the board, but it was no use. It would not yield. I need more leverage, he said to himself. Balancing on one foot, he braced his other against the window frame and started pulling again. The muscles in his forearms and back bulged as he strained against the board. Sweat rolled down his forehead and into his eyes. Come on, he pleaded with the wood. Come on. In his frustration, Johnson did not hear the soft tap, tap, tap on the floor behind him. Tap, 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 like a blind man with his cane. Tap, tap, tap. Then it was too late. It struck. The force of the attack rammed him face first up against the wall, knocking the wind out of him. Warm blood trickled from his nose and ran down his cheek. What was that? Turning around slowly, he could see, in the light from the window, his attacker. It was crouched inside an empty stall along the opposite wall, the legs tensed, ready to spring. It was a spider. No doubt one of the old man's experiments, but this was no ordinary spider. It was huge, about the size of a pit bull, with legs that extended out 3 or 4 feet on either side. Its eyes stared coldly at him. Johnson did a quick tally of his injuries. Except for his bloody nose, he was unharmed. Perhaps the large size of the creature made it difficult for it to mount an attack, he conjectured. Possibly he did not even recognize them as prey. Spiders normally eat moths and insects, he reminded himself, not human beings. When he was a kid, Johnson liked to throw twigs into a web just to see the spider's reaction. Invariably, after pouncing on the object, the spider would pluck it out of the web, turn it over, and drop it on the ground. Johnson hoped this spider would show the same lack of interest. From its vantage point at the other end of the barn, the creature seemed puzzled, unsure of itself. Spiders are cautious, he told himself. It's waiting for me to make the next move. Although every fiber in his body screamed, run, his brain told him to stay still. The spider was too big and too fast to outrun. I need a weapon, he told himself. Quickly looking about, he saw the rotten board from the window lying at his feet. It was about 2 feet long, with a jagged point at one end. It'll have to do. Slowly, he bent down to pick it up. The spider crouched low like a sprinter, ready to strike again. Johnson froze, his fingers only inches from the board. Easy, girl, he whispered softly. Easy. The spider relaxed, but not completely. Deliberately, it began to move forward. Tap, tap, tap. Johnson was amazed by the creature's grace. Like a ballerina tiptoeing in from the darkened wings of a theater, it was a marvel of beauty and design. The body, covered by fine gray hair, had the look of velvet, while the 8 legs that extended from the thorax provided speed and balance. As it approached Johnson, the spider carefully extended one foreleg towards him. Johnson quickly knocked it away with his hand. The creature stopped and cocked its plate-sized head to one side. The 8 eyes looked like black fists. Then the leg came forward again. At the tip, Johnson could see the spike-like claw for catching prey. It touched his left shoulder. Through his jacket, he could feel the sharp point digging into his skin. Johnson winced and stepped backwards into the wall, but there was no place to go. Slowly, the other foreleg came forward. Johnson recoiled, trying to ward off the attack with his free arm, but the creature was too strong. It brushed his arm aside as if it was a piece of lint and planted a second claw into his other shoulder. Johnson cried out, "Help! Help!" Then the spider reared up on its hind legs, forcing Johnson to his knees. For a brief moment, he and the creature looked into each other's eyes. It was almost like love. Then he saw the 6-inch fangs that extended from the head. Drops of venom gleamed in the half-light. He watched in fascination as the cruel daggers arched high over him. Then he screamed as they plunged deeply into his chest. Instantly, white, hot pain ripped through his body. But then it was gone. The spider had retreated back to the stall. Johnson knew that he only had a minute or two before the poison paralyzed him. "This is it," he said to himself, "my only chance." Ignoring his wounds, Johnson turned back to the window. Grabbing at the board, he yanked and pulled, but to no avail. Already the venom was having its effect. His hands were numb and his arms felt like lead. Gasping for air, he threw himself at the boards again and again. But it was no use. He was beaten. Great sobs shook his body as he slumped to the floor. "This can't be happening to me," he protested. "It's ridiculous." Looking back at the spider, he could see that it still had not moved. "What is she waiting for?" he wondered. "Why doesn't she finish me off?" He soon had his answer. Shimmering like a great overcoat, there was something on the spider's back. It moved and undulated like a small wave flowing back and forth. Then a piece of the wave pulled away and dropped on the floor. It was another spider, only a lot smaller, about the size of a rat. Johnson recalled that some spiders carrying their young on their backs. Horrified, he realized that he had stumbled into their nursery and it was feeding time. Another one dropped to the floor, and then another. Soon there was a long line of spiders slowly crawling towards him. Through fading eyesight, he saw the first one reach his foot. Tentatively, its foreleg probed the air until it found his leg and patted it. It was light and delicate, like the touch of a child. Johnson opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. The last thing Johnson saw before he lost consciousness was a spider tearing a piece of flesh from the back of his hand. Back at the farmhouse, the old man picked up the bottle of whiskey from the kitchen table, poured himself another drink, and plopped down on the ancient lazy boy recliner. "How long would it take, Jake?" asked the old woman. "Not long," he grunted. "They ain't it since Sunday." "Get a better sign. Attract more folks." "Nah, the sign's okay. Anyway, we don't need a crowd," said the old man, taking a long, hard swallow. "What are you going to do with this car?" she asked, standing at the window, admiring the now ownerless Lexus. "I hear young Dougal needs one for running moonshine. Willing to pay a good price, too," said the old man. "Won't he ask questions?" wondered the old woman, pouring a drink and easing herself down onto a dusty couch. "Nah, he don't care," snickered the old man. "I'll talk to him tomorrow. Meanwhile, pass the remote. Let's see what's on Dr. Phil."
chilling tales for dark nights.